Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel. My name is Adrienne Keyser. I'm your over 50s fashion diva, and here on my channel, we talk about fashion, of course, but also beauty, lifestyle, travel, and anything trending in social media and any of those topics. So if you want to stay relevant over 50, then you come to the right place. It is Saturday night movie night, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. Um, I see that my last movie night did pretty well. And so I thought I would go ahead and continue the series until you guys say we don't want any more of this. But tonight we're going to be doing the life of Coco Chanel. And I'm really excited about it because although I have seen movies and documentaries about her life, I think that there's going to be some new discoveries for me tonight. So I'm really excited to learn a lot more about this fashion icon, Coco Chanel. As you know, that is not her original name. And we will get into that in the movie. I don't want to do any spoilers. So, also because it is Saturday night, this is also my self care night. So, like last time, I'm going to be doing some self care as we watch the movie and react to it together. And let's see, what else can I say? I am going to set up my big screen so that I can actually watch the movie on the big screen and not just here on my computer. Um, so tonight I am going to do a mud mask. I may do my firming mask. I don't know what we're going to do tonight, but I do know that my nails are atrocious. I'm going to be honest. I'm a manicurist. I do have my license to do nails, but it's just not something that I do. And it's a shame because I really should. I don't do clients anymore. I haven't done that for many years. I'm just moving my computer back a little bit so I have some area to do my nails. So let's see. I am going to start with the mud mask and then we're going to go ahead and get started. Now, tonight, and also, I got to go grab my glass because that is what movie night is about. Having a little bit of self-care. I thought I cleaned my lens, but for some reason it's not looking crisp. Maybe that's just me. Anyway, so yeah, a little self-care, a little vino, and movie. Like, what could be better? So tonight I'm actually using this product, which is called Products Pure Mud. It's a body mud wrap, pure blah, blah, blah. I think that's in French. No additives, 100% natural, a Dead Sea sensation. My girlfriend actually got this for me a while back. And excuse me, when I was doing my 7-day skincare challenge, I did an all over body mask. And that was a nightmare. I felt like I was cleaning that stuff out of my shower for weeks. And so I decided that instead of using it on my body, I'm just going to use it on my face. And so that is the mud mask that we're going to use on the face for tonight. Before I get started, I am going to wash my hands, grab some wine, and then I'm going to go in with my simple micellar water. I just took a shower like a few hours ago and I didn't do any skincare at all because I knew I was going to get on camera live with you guys and do it then. So I really did not do any skincare in advance. And so, yeah, I just need like a minute to wash my hands, grab my wine, and come right back. Then we're going to jump right into the movie. And I actually found several different types of documentaries about her life. And I'm not really sure which one we're going to do because there's so many. But I think I'm going to add on a little extra bonus video at the end. Um, it may be a little too long, depending upon how long we go with Mademoiselle Chanel, that we might throw in a little extra bonus movie. But like I said, it depends on how long we go with Chanel. And yeah, I also feel like I need some air conditioning because I'm starting to sweat a little bit. All right, give me 60 seconds and I'll be right back. All right, hands are clean. We've got our adult grape juice that the algorithm doesn't seem to care for. So I'm going to be dipping off camera during the movie to get that done. Also, I'm going to be using my electric file. This is by Costless that I got on Amazon. So if you hear some weird drilling in the background during the movie, it's because I'm going to be using my electric file, which I'm charging at the moment. So that is what that sound will be if you hear it. Now let's go ahead and pop on over. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing with you guys because I want you to see the number of videos that I actually found. So let's go ahead, share screen. Oh, before I get started, I actually thought I had logged out of all of my other browsers. Oh, hang on. Thought I had logged out of all of my other browsers. So I don't want to have any lag time during our movie. I'm going to close Instagram. I'm closing Instagram again, closing Canva. Good Lord. How many things do I have open? I really did think that I had closed everything, you guys. So closing up everything. And I also want to and I promise that next time this will be ready. I actually thought I was ready. I thought that I was ready. So I'm having issues with my Instagram. All right, different tab. Okay, so these are all in my saved. Oh, wait, sorry. Watch later. So what I put in my watch later list is, oh, I thought I took McQueen out. I didn't want anything in there. So I was thinking about doing this one with Philip Treacy with you guys, but I think that we may have to save it for another night because we do have so many going on for Chanel. And also, I wanted to do this one. This will be a separate movie night. The Old Money Families Who Built the Fashion Industry. That looks really intriguing. It was only 5 months ago that they put it together, this creator. So I'm really interested in watching that. So maybe we'll do a separate movie night for that. So we've got, and then of course I'm doing Dior and all that, some other things. So we've got Chanel Save Its Shattered Reputation, which we are going to watch because, as you all know, the current creative director just recently left Chanel. So I'm interested in seeing this video for sure. Then we've got the controversial history of Chanel, which I think is what we're going to watch this evening. We've got Coco Chanel, Nazi mistress, addict, spy, and the world's most glamorous woman. Sounds intriguing, right? Then we've got Coco Chanel, fashion icon and collaborator documentary. And then discovering the life behind the brand of Coco Chanel and Coco Chanel's apartment, which we're definitely going to watch at the end. So let's go ahead and start with, I don't know. It's either going to be this one or this one. Well, this one was 9 months ago. This one's got 1 million views. This one has 410. Let's see. Let's go with this one. And if it's subtitled and too difficult for everyone to follow, then we'll move on to the other. But let's see. I think that the other one is going to be more
known as Coco in her early 20s when she...
Oh, this has an ad in it.
The woman known to history as Coco Chanel was born on the 19th of August 1883 in the poorhouse of the town of Saumur in western France as Gabrielle Bonheur Chanel.
All right, this looks pretty good. This has a lot of subscribers, a lot of shares 9 months ago. All right, I think that this one will work. So let's start it from the beginning. I don't want you guys to miss anything. I am going to lower the volume a little bit just because I've found that if I don't, then you can't hear my commentary. Make it full screen. And let's get going. All right. Coco Chanel, fashion icon and collaborator. I really want to get into the whole thing about her being a Nazi. Oh, wait, I saw another video earlier that I wanted to add to my list, which was about her and Wallace Simpson. So we may watch that also at the end. If I can find it again, I'm sure I can, but we may watch that as well. All right, let's get going. We are how far in? We are already 13 minutes in. Let's go.
The woman known to history as Coco Chanel was born on the 19th of August 1883 in the poorhouse of the town of Saumur in western France as Gabrielle Bonheur Chanel. Gabrielle's father was Albert Chanel, a street vendor who sold work clothes and other garments, often traveling between towns and villages in western France. Her mother was Eugénie Jeanne de Vol, a laundrywoman who worked in the Saumur poorhouse run by the religious order of the Sisters of Providence. Coco's baptismal namesake, Gabrielle Bonheur, was a nun at the poorhouse in Saumur, who agreed to act as her godmother. Gabrielle would only become known as Coco in her early 20s, when she would adopt the moniker as a stage name while singing in café cabarets. Her birth name was originally registered through the Saumur poorhouse as Gabrielle Bonheur Chasnel, with an S in the middle of her last name.
I didn't know that.
Presumably a clerical error, as her mother was too ill to be present at the registration, and her father was traveling, selling clothes at the time of her birth. In later life, Coco never changed this error on her birth certificate. Historians have assumed that she did not do so because it would have required acknowledging her origins at the Saumur poorhouse.
Wow.
Her self-mythologizing in later years would attempt to cover up her very modest background.
This video is brought to you by War Thunder, the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever created. With War Thunder, you can play
All right.
planes, helicopters,
Let's see
ships,
if we
and
can
more than
skip the ad here.
2,000 tanks in dynamic.
I mean, I don't have. I have a full subscription, so I have full YouTube, so we don't have to watch that nonsense. We could skip it.
Gabrielle was the second child, born to Albert and Eugénie. They had already had another daughter, Julia, born the previous year in 1882. Yet the couple were not married at a time when having one, let alone two, children out of wedlock was frowned upon in Catholic France. Gabrielle's mother's family began to apply pressure on Albert Chanel to marry Eugénie, which he did in 1884. Gabrielle's childhood was an extremely difficult one. Her parents eventually ended up having 6 children. After
Jeez.
Julia and Gabrielle, they would go on to have 3 boys and 1 more daughter.
Wow.
Alphonse in 1885, Antoinette in 1887, Lucien in 1889, and Augustin in
I
1891.
don't think I knew if
Though
she
the
had
latter
that many
died at
siblings.
just 6 months of age. The family lived in poverty-stricken circumstances, eventually settling in a one-room apartment in the town of Brive-la-Gaillarde, to the east of Bordeaux and south of Limoges. It was here that Gabrielle's mother died in 1894, when Chanel was just 11 years of age. In later years, Coco claimed that Eugénie died of tuberculosis, a disease which was ravaging Western society at the time, but it seems more likely that she passed from a combination of the family's impoverished conditions and pneumonia, exacerbated by her failure to recover from one pregnancy after another in the 1880s.
Wow.
When she died, Albert was unable to look after the 5 surviving children and maintain his job. Thus, the Chanel boys were quickly sent out to get jobs, while Gabrielle, Julia, and Antoinette were sent to a convent in Aubazine, which functioned as an orphanage. They were raised here throughout their teenage years in a tough, Spartan environment. Yet it was significant in Chanel's development in one way in particular. It was here that she first learned to sew in the mid to late 1890s. When she turned 18 years of age in 1901, Gabrielle had to leave the convent at Aubazine. She headed for the nearby town of Moulins, and it was here that she first acquired the name Coco as a stage name, when she became a performer at the local cabaret pavilion. This was the era of the Moulin Rouge and the Folies Bergère in France, while the venues where Coco performed in the town of Moulins in the 1900s were doubtlessly less salubrious than those in Paris. They were indicative of the wider Belle Époque culture into which she was emerging as a young woman. By the mid-1900s, she had drifted to the larger town of Vichy in the Auvergne-Rhône region of central France, with its numerous concert and cabaret halls, often spending the summer months here when Vichy was visited by many tourists, looking to avail of the spa baths and then returning to Moulins in the off-season. It was in the latter town where she began a relationship with Etienne Balsan, a former cavalry officer and member of a leading textile design family. They began a lengthy affair. Some studies of Coco Chanel's life have implied that her nephew, André Palas, was in fact an illegitimate child born to Coco from her affair with Balsan.
Whoa.
But this is almost certainly incorrect.
Oh.
In reality, André was her nephew, having been born sometime earlier to Coco's older sister Julia, and a man whom Julia had met while still living at the convent in Aubazine. Julia ultimately ended her own life when the boy's father left her for another woman, and Coco undertook raising her effectively orphaned nephew for many years, sending him to boarding school while she worked in Moulins, Vichy, and other towns in the 1900s,
I didn't know that.
and then in Paris in the 1910s. By the late 1900s, Chanel had set herself up in Paris, thanks in large part to financing from her new lover, Captain Arthur Edward Capel, the son of a wealthy British shipping merchant and a noted polo player in England, along with backing from Balsan, who she continued to see at the same time. With Balsan and Capel's money and resources, Chanel was able to begin her first forays into the fashion world of the French capital, using her sewing experience and skills acquired at Aubazine. In 1909, she set up a millinery shop at 160 Boulevard Malesherbes. Her apartment upstairs, which was provided to her by Balsan, became a meeting point or salon for members of the Parisian French upper middle class. All of this was important in more ways than one. While Balsaint and Capel provided Chanel with the material resources necessary to start the House of Chanel company, they also introduced her to French high society in ways which allowed a woman from a very humble background in Western France to begin to learn what people with money wanted to wear and generally how they wanted to be perceived by those around them. This was as crucial to the early success of Chanel as the financial backing of her lovers.
I mean,
At first, Chanel's
amazing.
business focused primarily on making hats. It was this activity for which she first acquired a license, becoming a milliner in Paris in 1910, the year in which the Chanel company is said to have started. Her first full boutique was established at 21 Rue Cambon, a stone's throw from the Place de la Concorde, the Tuileries Gardens and the Louvre on the right bank of the Seine. Soon she began expanding the business, with a particular emphasis on sports clothes that were fashionable as well as practical, what would today be called a country club aesthetic. This consisted of blazers, lined shirts, blouses, sweaters, and jacket suits at a time when individuals still played sports like tennis while wearing full-length trousers and other clothing which restricted one's movement. By 1913, Chanel had opened 2 additional stores, one in Deauville in Normandy in northwestern France, and another in the town of Biarritz on the Bay of Biscay, where she catered as much for the British and Spanish tourist trade as her French clientele. By that time, the business was successful enough that she was effectively financially independent, though she continued to see Capel throughout the 1910s, even after his marriage to Lady Diana Wyndham in 1918. However, he was killed in a car accident the following year, an event which Chanel stated many years later that she never fully recovered from emotionally. Chanel's business was, like a great many others, negatively impacted by the outbreak of the First World War in the summer of 1914. With most of Europe's great powers at war with one another, supply routes and trade were hampered across Europe, while the German campaign against shipping in the Atlantic Ocean also limited the supply of raw materials to France from the Americas. Consequently, the French textile industry encountered difficulties. But for Chanel, whose business was based on quality rather than quantity, things remained afloat. Her store in Biarritz did particularly well. Located in southwestern France, as far away from the fighting of the Western Front in...
I just want to pause right here really quickly, just to say that, one, I did not realize that it was her boyfriends that actually funded her getting her first store. And number two, I thought the reason that I wanted to include Philip Treacy is because I did know that Coco Chanel started off as a milliner, and Philip Treacy is one of the greatest milliners of our time. And also that a lot of what Coco Chanel did in the early days of her career is exactly why I love Tom Brown. And he is exactly like Coco Chanel. They had a very similar aesthetic as far as, you know, doing that athleisure country club sort of vibe to their collections. So anyway, just wanted to throw that in. Let's carry on with the movie. I'm going to back it up just a second to make sure you guys didn't miss anything. All right, here we go.
German campaign against shipping in the Atlantic Ocean also limited the supply of raw materials to France from the Americas. Consequently, the French textile industry encountered difficulties. But for Chanel, whose business was based on quality rather than quantity, things remained afloat. Her store in Biarritz did particularly well. Located in southwestern France, as far away from the fighting of the Western Front in northeastern France as one could get, the location benefited from neighboring Spain's neutrality and the influx of British moneyed tourists who could still afford to travel, but found Paris or northern France to be off-limits during wartime. By 1917, Harper's Bazaar was reporting that Chanel's clothing was considered to be the most fashionable in wartime Europe. As a result of this success, Chanel was able to accumulate enough capital that when the war finally came to an end in November 1918, she was in a position in 1919 to purchase 31 Rue Cambon, a building just down the street from her original millinery shop in central Paris. Here she founded her first official boutique in the French capital shortly after the war ended. The post-war years were not ones of automatic recovery for the European economy. The years between 1918 and 1923 could be considered in many ways just as difficult as the 4 years of the First World War. as the Spanish flu swept across Europe in 1918 and 1919, killing millions as it did, while civil wars, revolutions, and wars of independence ravaged nearly half of Europe's nations, notably Russia, Germany, Turkey, and the many constituent nations of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. In this environment, luxury brands like Chanel faced a challenging time, yet this was also an age in which the upper class's wealth was relatively impregnable. Coco consequently benefited from her clientele being able to continue to buy her products in the late 1910s and early 1920s. Indeed, she actively courted the upper class and middle class intellectuals and bohemians in France and beyond, realizing that who wore her clothes was nearly as important as the quality of the products themselves. It was an early indication of her awareness of the importance of effective marketing, and Chanel was in essence a prophet of 20th century branding techniques in many ways. As the 1910s gave way to the 1920s, the Chanel brand and company really began to take off. This was aided by the economic boom, which began from the early 1920s onwards, as the political situation across Europe began to stabilize. Chanel was a great beneficiary of the Roaring Twenties, both because people had disposable income to spend on designer clothing and apparel, and also because Chanel's designs were of their time for the more liberal 1920s. Chanel clothing became particularly prized by flappers, the name given to young women in the 1920s, who preferred less conservative clothing and who enjoyed jazz music, socializing, and who had a much less conservative outlook on drinking, sexual activity, and public conduct than the older generations. In tandem, Chanel's profit and business operations began to expand significantly. By 1927, for instance, she had expanded to occupy a block of buildings, running from number 23 to number 31 on the Rue Cambon in central Paris, while outlets were opened in other towns and cities as demand increased amongst the middle classes. The 1920s also saw Chanel launch two of its most iconic products. In 1921, Coco released the company's first perfume. Chanel No. 5, as she named it, was a fragrance devised by the Franco-Russian chemist Ernest Beau. It was a balance of the delicate fragrances often worn by women of high society and the more daring, musky scents favored by courtesans, thus appealing to a range of women in the more sexually liberated 1920s. The bottle in which Chanel was sold from its earliest days has become an iconic part of its brand, with a striking square, glass bottle, although the bevel has changed over the decades. The inspiration for this seems to have come from the toiletries, which Capel used to carry with him when he and Chanel were romantically involved in the 1900s and 1910s. These were held in plainer bottles than the elaborate cut-glass perfume bottles sold to women by many fashion houses. Chanel evidently liked the simplicity of the aftershave bottles and used them for Chanel No. 5, although it has also been argued that she was effectively mimicking the design of a whiskey decanter. Finally, the name was derived from the fact that when Beau had drawn up a number of different scents to present to Chanel, the one which she liked and which became Chanel No. 5 was simply the one located in the fifth vial presented to her. From such rudimentary beginnings was Chanel No. 5 born. Chanel used a clever marketing campaign whereby she first gave bottles of the fragrance to high society friends to generate interest in it. When it finally went to market in her boutiques, sales of the much-hyped perfume were immediately high. Nearly as iconic as Chanel No. 5 was the little black dress, which Chanel began to sell in 1926. Although black dresses had been a luxury item of high society during the Renaissance and Baroque periods, black clothing had become synonymous in the 19th century with funerals and with mourning. Chanel hoped to reverse this development, arguing that black dresses should be the height of fashion. As with all Chanel products by the mid-1920s, marketing was key. When the company began selling its first little black dress, it was accompanied by a spread in Vogue magazine with a picture of the short, calf-length, straight, and relatively simple piece of clothing. Alongside this, Vogue ran an editorial in which it hypothesized that Chanel's little black dress was set to become the fashion equivalent of Henry Ford's Model T car, an item of high fashion which could be produced in bulk and so sold at a reasonable price, a development which the magazine supposed would make it, quote, a sort of uniform for all women of taste. They were not entirely wrong. Sales of Chanel's little black dress were impressive, beginning to overturn the Victorian consensus perception of black dresses being funerary and mourning attire. On the back of the success of Chanel No. 5 and the Little Black Dress, Chanel's product range continued to expand in the 1920s and into the early 1930s, unhindered to a large extent by the Great Depression, which followed the Wall Street crash of the autumn of 1929. Her designs were eclectic. For instance, in the early 1920s, Coco began experimenting with Slavic-inspired designs. One evening dress, which Chanel began selling in 1922, came with a matching babushka headscarf. This was in part owing to her partnership with the embroidery house Kitmir, which had been established in Paris in the post-war period by Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, a granddaughter of Tsar Alexander II, who had ruled Russia as a reformer from 1855 until his assassination in 1881. Maria had fled her homeland with the onset of the Russian Revolution in 1917, and now brought an Eastern fashion aesthetic to the French capital, which Coco incorporated into her clothing range in the 1920s. Eventually, the collaboration between Chanel and Kitmir ended in 1928, when the Grand Duchess sold the business, which had been poorly managed and hemorrhaged money despite the success of its association with Chanel. Other successes of Chanel in the 1920s included the introduction of the first women's suit range, while the first Chanel handbag, the design of which was inspired, like so many other Chanel products, by the utility and simplicity of male soldiers' bags, was launched in 1929.
Wow.
One final element of Chanel's life which is worth noting for its lasting impact on society was sunbathing. For centuries in early modern Europe and into the 19th century and early 20th century, pale skin had been viewed as the ideal of female beauty. Cosmetics were designed to lighten the skin, and upper-class women and aristocrats generally tended to avoid the sun and its tanning effect. Yet there was a growing amount of scientific information to suggest that a certain amount of direct sunlight was good for avoiding diseases like rickets. Thus, there was a movement towards what we would now call sunbathing in the 1900s and 1910s, but it was Chanel who really popularized the notion in the 1920s. In 1923, while on a cruise on the French Riviera, Coco was sunburned. In the days that followed, as the redness turned to tan, she was photographed stepping from a boat at the seaside resort of Cannes. The photos of a woman who by the mid-1920s had developed a reputation as a paragon of fashion and taste quickly set off a trend whereby having a tan became a positive in European society. Incredibly, this simple act has had a lasting influence, and sunbathing became a 20th century phenomenon. In the course of the 1920s, Chanel began to associate her brand with the most visible aspects of contemporary popular culture. This meant anything on stage or on screen. Hence, in 1924, she designed the costumes for the dance opera Le Train Bleu, directed by the Russian ballet composer Serge Diaghilev and choreographed by Vaslav Nijinsky. It was the first of numerous stage productions for which Chanel provided costumes and outfits. This pattern continued into the 1930s, and in 1931, Coco headed for Hollywood at the invitation of Samuel Goldwyn, the head of one of the largest studios emerging in Los Angeles at the dawn of the age of the talkies.
All right, another quick pause. Wow, so much information to unpack there. Okay, so we're talking about sunbathing. I did not realize that she had such a big influence on that. And I knew that sunbathing was a thing, and I knew that, that era was like the era of sunbathing. I didn't realize how much effect Chanel had in that. So that's kind of fascinating. Now we're getting ready to go into her going into MGM, which is amazing. Okay. All right. Let's keep going. Just wanted to side note that. I'll back it up a little bit so that you didn't miss it. Just a bit.
She designed the costumes for the dance opera Le Train Bleu, directed by the Russian ballet composer Serge Diaghilev and choreographed by Vaslav Nijinsky. It was the first of numerous stage productions for which Chanel provided costumes and outfits. This pattern continued into the 1930s, and in 1931, Coco headed for Hollywood at the invitation of Samuel Goldwyn, the head of one of the largest studios emerging in Los Angeles at the dawn of the age of the talkies. Goldwyn, a Polish-American businessman, had met Coco while holidaying in Monte Carlo. The deal she reached with Goldwyn was enormous, with the studio head offering her $1 million, the equivalent of upwards of $100 million in today's money, to visit
Crazy.
America twice a year to design clothes for his films.
Wow.
However, while she designed dresses for a number of
No,
films in the
that was a
1930s
contract.
and acquired both Marlene Dietrich and Greta Garbo as clients, Chanel found American culture garish and the world of Hollywood films unsophisticated by comparison with interwar Paris. Her arrangement with Goldwyn dwindled as the 1930s progressed.
Oh,
Coco's
wow.
personal life was tumultuous by the time she was visiting Hollywood in the 1930s. In the post-war years, she was involved in a number of high-profile affairs and relationships. For instance, in the mid-1920s, she was involved with Pierre Reverdy, a French surrealist poet whose work inspired much of the Dada movement. More
Oh,
controversial was her relationship with Paul Iribe between 1931 and his death in 1935. Iribe was a designer and illustrator who had worked for Cecil B. DeMille in Hollywood in the 1920s,
I did know that.
notably drawing up the designs for the look of Egypt for DeMille's version of the Ten Commandments in 1923. Between 1933 and 1935, Coco helped finance Iribe's journal Le Témoin, The Witness, a publication which presented the artworks of Iribe and others. The 69 issues of the journal, which appeared in the mid-1930s, were highly political, with Iribe demonstrating a charged sense of antipathy towards foreigners in France, a pronounced anti-Semitism, and an ultra-nationalist platform.
Oh,
As
boy.
we will see shortly, this appears not to have conflicted with Chanel's own politics by the 1930s. Beyond her sexual relationships, Chanel continued to mix in bohemian and artistic circles in Paris throughout the 1920s and 1930s. These were hedonistic times, and there was one rumor around Paris at the time that Coco had actually acquired her first name in reference to the prolific quantities of cocaine taken at her parties in the 1920s.
It
While
was
this
legal then.
explanation is probably somewhat spurious, we do know that Chanel developed a habit of injecting herself with morphine on a daily basis
Oh,
in
I
the
didn't
early
know that.
1930s.
Wow.
She would remain addicted to opiates for the remainder of her life.
I didn't know that.
The
Wow.
1930s saw Chanel branching out further again into women's jewelry. In 1932, the company held an exhibition of its first items, one which made clear that this range would certainly be on the higher end of Chanel's products. The show featured products called the Comet and the Fountain, two necklaces containing multiple diamonds. While this show presented material which was not exactly for general purchase, the 1930s were notable for the manner in which Chanel began to incorporate rhinestones and other smaller and more modest gemstones into the fashion house's dresses and products, something which disseminated into other fashion houses in the years that followed. The end result of all of this rampant growth in the 1920s and early 1930s, and the manner in which Chanel had established itself as the preeminent fashion house in not just France, but in Europe, was a company which had a huge revenue and that employed upwards of 4,000 people in various capacities as seamstresses, shop employees, and designers. Only one company could rival it by the mid-1930s. This was the House of Schiaparelli, which had been founded in Paris in 1927 by the
I have
Italian
that
aristocrat fashion
movie.
designer
Also, we're going to do
Elsa
Schiaparelli's
Schiaparelli.
movie night.
Beginning with knitwear and then moving into avant-garde and surrealist design, Schiaparelli soon followed Chanel's lead in associating with some of Paris and France's leading artistic figures in order to promote her products. Notably, in Schiaparelli's case, the artist and filmmaker Salvador Dali, and the poet, playwright, and visual artist Jean Cocteau. By the early 1930s, Schiaparelli's range had expanded dramatically. Although many individuals lambasted Schiaparelli's designs in the 1930s as being impractical or even bizarre, she was the only designer in France in the 1930s whose influence and reputation matched that of Chanel. Perhaps if history had not unfolded as it did in Europe in the late 1930s to mid-1940s, Coco and the House of Chanel's enormous success might have continued unmarred by controversy. But a chain of events beginning in Germany and the choices she would make in that decade would ultimately cast a shroud over Coco Chanel's legacy. Early in 1933, after a rapid ascent in political popularity, Following economic turmoil, partially caused by the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, came to power in Germany. They were determined to reverse what they perceived as the humiliation foisted upon Germany at the end of the First World War, and to make their nation the foremost power of continental Europe. This would mean a new war, with France being one of the primary targets, not just to recover the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, which had been lost following the First World War, but also to dominate Germany's western neighbor. Initially, the Nazis had anticipated needing a gradual military build-up to accomplish their aims, intending to wait until 1941 or 1942 to initiate full-scale war.
Pausing again. Sorry. Two quick things. One thing that you should know about me is I am a history buff. I actually enjoy watching documentaries about the different wars. So this is kind of right up my alley. And of course, I know all about World War One and World War II. So this is all really fun for me. But also, I wanted to mention that we were talking about Dali. You should go and check out the Dali museum in Paris. It's absolutely amazing. And there's a lot of photographs of him in his life. And there are pictures of him with Coco Chanel. So just wanted to pause there. We're back at the war. Let's keep going. Backing it up ever so slightly.
This was a step too far for both Britain and France, and they declared war on Germany in response. This was the beginning of what would become the Second World War. For Coco Chanel and many other French people, the outbreak of the war in the autumn of 1939 impacted little on their lives to begin with. The fighting was largely confined to Poland, with only limited border skirmishes and forays taking place along the Franco-German border. Hence, while the news of the German occupation of Poland was concerning for many in Paris, beyond the obvious signs of military mobilization and the imposition of rationing, life went on much as it previously had in the final months of 1939 and into early 1940. However, normal life came to a shuddering halt in the late spring, as the Nazis first conducted a blistering campaign against Denmark and Norway, and then proceeded to invade the Low Countries and northeastern France. The speed of the German advance caught both the French military and the British Expeditionary Force in northern France by surprise, and within weeks the Nazis were closing in on the capital. The French government fled on the 10th of June, and the Germans occupied the city 4 days later. A collaborationist government negotiated surrender terms, whereby the southern half of France would be ruled by a semi-autonomous government based out of the town of Vichy, where Chanel had spent summers performing in the 1900s. But Paris was to be occupied by the Nazis for the next 4 years. It was a period during which countless French men and women like Coco Chanel would have to decide whether to resist the regime or collaborate with it. As we will see, Coco Chanel chose the latter. Upon the commencement of war in September 1939, Chanel had released a public statement affirming her belief that a period of renewed warfare across Europe was not a time for high fashion, and that she consequently intended to close all of her shops, except for the flagship enterprise on the Rue de Cambon. This was not necessarily an unreasonable step to take. After all, with rationing being introduced across the continent and trade networks disintegrating as nations went to war with each other, there would be a lack of raw materials available to make high-end fashion, and few people would have been comfortable investing in conspicuous signs of wealth in such straitened times. But it has also been suggested that Chanel used the outbreak of the war to exact revenge on her employees, many of whom had engaged in disputes over working conditions and pay in 1936, during a general strike amongst the French labor unions. Whatever her motives might have been, we know what fate ultimately befell Chanel's employees. Nearly 4,000 people found themselves out of work from the late autumn of 1939 onwards. The House of Chanel had effectively been furloughed until the end of the war.
I didn't know that.
This has raised questions as to what Chanel was doing herself throughout the conflict, especially after the occupation of Paris in the summer of 1940. The answer, revealed by a number of sources in recent times, is not as one would hope for a historical figure of such cultural influence. Chanel would spend much of the war consorting and collaborating with the Nazi regime. Her willingness to countenance the Nazis in France was seen early on when she took up residence in the Hotel Ritz on the Place Vendôme in central Paris.
Oh, I've
Following
been
the
there.
occupation of the French capital in June 1940, the Ritz had quickly become a favorite haunt of the leading members of the occupation Nazi government. Thus, anyone staying here or consorting with other guests was making a clear statement in favor of the German takeover of France and
Oh,
Nazi ideology.
I
Moreover,
did know
this
that about the Ritz.
interpretation of
I didn't
Chanel's
know that
choice in
about Chanel
residence
at the
is
Ritz.
aligned with Chanel's own attested political and racial views by the early 1940s, which were foreshadowed by her relationship with Uribe and her support for his ultra-nationalist journal, The Witness, in the 1930s. As such, her decision to shut Chanel's stores and operations across France in the autumn of 1939 has been viewed by some historians as part of an effort to undermine her Jewish business partners. One particular instance of
Interesting.
such efforts stands out: her attempt in 1941 to use anti-Semitic laws in Nazi-occupied France to steal company profits from her Jewish business partner, whose descendants, in a twist of fate, would go on to own the Chanel brand to this day. While Chanel was the face and primary owner of the House of Chanel, she had had a significant business partner since the early 1920s. This was Pierre Wertheimer, a scion of a German Jewish family who had moved from the Alsace region around the Franco-German border to Paris, following the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. They remained in the French capital after the swift Prussian victory in that war, and Pierre was born in the city in 1888. As a young man in his 20s, Pierre became involved in the cosmetics industry in France and helped develop a dry rouge for the notable French makeup company Bourjois. Such was the success of this product that Wertheimer rose quickly within Bourjois, and in 1917 he and his brother Paul had become directors thereof. It was just a few short years later that Chanel and Wertheimer began negotiations to use Wertheimer's business contacts and industry links to help market Chanel No. 5 globally. Eventually, Chanel,
didn't know
Wertheimer,
all
and
of these
several
things.
other French and Jewish investors in the cosmetics and fragrance industry reached an arrangement in the mid-1920s, whereby the Wertheimers would effectively manufacture, distribute, and otherwise manage Chanel No. 5. They would receive
this.
70% of the profits in return for effectively running Parfum Chanel. As the subsidiary became known, Coco would become an all but silent partner. She would have to do very little henceforth and would receive 10% of all profits based on her intellectual copyright of the fragrance and branding. While
Wow.
many would have been
Didn't know
happy with
any
this
of that.
arrangement, as the Wertheimers expanded the reach of Chanel No. 5 and increased sales in the course of the 1920s and 1930s, Coco became increasingly disgruntled. In 1935, she had already attempted to sue Pierre and his family, but the suit had failed as Coco was trying to dispute the validity of a binding legal agreement, which she had freely entered into years ago. She now set out to use the occupation of France by the Nazis and the pronounced anti-Semitism of the new regime against the Wertheimers and their Jewish heritage.
Oh, wow.
Beginning in
Didn't know any
1941,
of this.
she began petitioning the German occupation government in France to be given sole control of Parfum Chanel, using a Nazi law which allowed people of allegedly Aryan race to take over Jewish businesses. She was also able to claim that the Wertheimers had abandoned the business when they fled to the United States to avoid Nazi persecution in 1940. However, she was surprised to learn in the course of the summer and autumn of 1941 that Wertheimer had taken steps to prevent her seizing the company.
Oh.
Before he and his family fled France, he had transferred his 70% stake, and with it the controlling shares, to Félix Amiot, a businessman of Christian and French heritage with whom the Nazis would not interfere.
Wow.
Thus, Coco failed to secure control over Parfum Chanel from the Wertheimers during the war, but the entire incident evinced her willing to use anti-Semitic laws for personal gain.
Wow.
But Chanel's support for the Nazi regime and its ideology extended further. It is now clear that from 1940, she was deeply involved with the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD, an internal security service force within Nazi Germany and the occupied parts of Europe, which was headed in Western Europe by Walter Schellenberg. The SD is less notorious today than the dreaded Gestapo amongst the German security forces, but its range of operations and overall control of Nazi policing in countries like France was actually considerably greater than those of the Gestapo throughout the Second World War. Chanel had evidently come into contact with the SD and Schellenberg very soon after the Nazis occupied Paris in the midsummer of 1940. It seems beyond dispute today that she was an SD agent in Paris from that time onwards for the next 4 years. Given the nature of this activity, much of the documentary records for this clandestine work would necessarily have been destroyed, as the Nazis burnt their records in the French capital in advance of the Allied capture of the city in the late summer of 1944. But documents have been found in recent years which referred to Chanel as Agent F7124 in occupied France.
Ooh.
This, along with ancillary information, points clearly to Chanel's collaboration with the Nazi regime. Another aspect
This
of
was
this
all the part I
entanglement
wanted
with
to
the
know
Third
about.
Reich concerned Chanel's love life. Sometime after the German occupation of Paris in 1940, Coco began a relationship with a diplomatic
That's amazing.
attaché to the occupation regime in the French capital and also served as an Abwehr spy in Paris. He had close contacts with Heinrich Himmler, the head of the German SS and one of the senior-most members of the entire Nazi regime, and Joseph Goebbels, the German propaganda minister who had a major role in spying, propaganda and legal matters in France from 1940 onwards. By 1942, Chanel and von Dinklage were romantically involved with each other, and this continued throughout the German occupation of France and beyond. There is no doubting that this relationship spilled over from their personal lives into cooperation on various espionage and spying activities in Western Europe during the war.
Wow.
Perhaps the most explicit sign of this is that Chanel was considered for a time as a potential negotiator and liaison between the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, and elements within the Nazi regime led by Himmler, who considered that it might be best to negotiate surrender terms with the Western Allies rather than face the possibility of the Soviet Union overrunning Germany. This did not lead to constructive talks, but as we will see shortly, Churchill did intervene on Chanel's behalf in the closing stages of the war and following its conclusion in the summer of 1945. In some instances, there is even more explicit evidence of Chanel's involvement in various clandestine Nazi activities. One such case was Operation Modelhood, a planned spy operation which was to be part of a speculative initiative which the Nazi regime began considering in 1942 to take control of Spain, a country which was headed by the fascist regime of General Francisco Franco, but which had decided to remain neutral in the war. Operation Modelhood, or Model Hat, involved Chanel as an Abwehr or Nazi counterintelligence agent heading to Madrid in 1943 to attempt to convince the British ambassador in the Spanish capital, Sir Samuel Hoare, that the Nazis were considering a negotiated peace. The mission subsequently led to Chanel heading to Berlin to meet with Schellenberg along with von Dinklage concerning the scheme, one which became extremely complicated as there were suggestions that Chanel could employ her contacts in Britain, which reached all the way up to Churchill, to aid in any effort by the Nazi regime to win the war diplomatically, even as its armed forces were suffering enormous reverses on all fronts against the Allied nations. However, Operation Modelhood was a dead letter from its very inception, as a young Anglo-Italian woman with whom Chanel had originally traveled to Madrid, Vera Bat Lombardy, ultimately betrayed details of the plan when they reached Spain. In the end, Chanel's efforts to aid the Nazi regime in its decline served only in retrospect to reveal her as an agent of Nazism and Hitler's regime in occupied France. By early 1944, Chanel must have been aware that her collaboration with the Nazi regime and the German security forces during the occupation of France could become extremely problematic for her before long. While the first years of the Second World War were marked by a run of immense victories for German armies across Europe, things had run aground for the Nazis in the winter of 1941, as the German advance into Russia stalled outside Moscow and Leningrad, and the United States then entered the war on the side of Britain and the Soviet Union, following the attack on its Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor by Germany's ally, the Empire of Japan, early that December. 1942 and early 1943 were the tipping point of the war, as the Western Allies achieved victory over Germany and Italy in the North African theater, and the Germans lost the Battle of Stalingrad to the Soviet Union in a conflict which became the crucible of the war. With a southern front established in Sicily in the summer of 1943, the Allies' thoughts turned to invading France and ending the Nazi occupation of the north of the country. The D-Day landings opened the Western Front in early June of 1944, with Paris one of the Allies' primary targets. Though fierce fighting across northern France slowed matters, the Americans, British forces, Canadians, and their allies arrived outside Paris on the 19th of August 1944. Just 6 days later, the Nazi occupation of the French capital was finally ended after 4 long years. As elsewhere across Europe in 1944 and 1945, public attention quickly turned to identifying those who had collaborated with the Nazis and how they should be punished for doing so. It was not long before Chanel's activities during the Nazi occupation of Paris were called into question. In the autumn of 1943, the Free French government, based out of France's colony of Algeria, had established the Commission d'Épuration, a judicial committee which was to oversee the prosecution of French collaborationist war criminals once France was liberated from Nazi rule. Although the number of people prosecuted by the commission was dwarfed by the number of summary executions carried out in France in 1944 and 1945, it did prosecute tens of thousands of individuals. Amongst those questioned by the commission was Coco Chanel, who was first detained and questioned by the commission in September 1944, weeks after the liberation of Paris. However, Chanel's was not a straightforward case. She had not held any public position within the Nazi occupation government. There was furthermore no documentation to hand at the time which proved beyond a doubt Chanel's involvement with Schellenberg's SD or the Abwehr, while her relationship with von Dinklage and her known fraternization with the upper brass of the Nazi occupation government at the Hotel Ritz throughout the war certainly compromised public perceptions of Chanel. There was little evidence with which to charge her with a serious crime. Moreover, it has been widely speculated ever since that Winston Churchill, who had known Chanel for many years prior to the war, intervened on her behalf to have Coco released from the scrutiny of the Commission d'Épuration.
So this is why I want to watch the video, and we might go ahead and watch it at the end with her and Wallace Simpson, because I just want to know what that relationship was like. Because we all know that, well, if you are a history buff, then you all know that when the king abdicated from the UK, from Britain, he had ties with the Nazis, him and Wallace Simpson. So it'll be fascinating to see the story between Coco Chanel and her. All right, let's keep going. I'm going to back it up just a second.
Who had known Chanel for many years prior to the war,
Only 20 minutes
intervened
left
on her behalf to have Coco released from the scrutiny of the Commission d'Épuration. This remains a speculative claim, however, and there is no concrete evidence to confirm this. With the end of the war, a tricky business issue also quickly arose for Chanel. Pierre Wertheimer and his family had fled to the United States in the wake of the advancing Nazi regime in 1940. But while Chanel had sought to use the Wertheimers' Jewish heritage against them under Nazi law to gain control of Parfum Chanel, during the German occupation of France, Pierre's decision to transfer ownership of the company to Félix Amiot before his family left Europe had foiled her plans. Now, in the aftermath of the conflict, the dispute arose yet again. Curiously, Chanel decided to hire René de Chambrun, the son-in-law of Pierre Laval, the former Prime Minister of Vichy France, who had been executed in October 1945 on account of his role in the collaborationist regime. The case was a troubling one for both parties. Chanel did not wish to have her wartime record dragged out in public, while for Wertheimer, although he had done nothing wrong, the reality was that if Coco's collaboration with the Nazis was aired extensively in public, it would quite possibly lead to a boycott of Chanel perfumes and a drastic decline in his own profit margins. Accordingly, a settlement was concluded in the early summer of 1947, without airing the company's unsavory secrets in public, whereby Wertheimer would retain the controlling interest at Parfum Chanel, but Coco herself would continue to receive 2% of the profits from any and all future sales, as well as other financial investments. It might seem as though this was a financial defeat, but in reality, the sums involved made Coco Chanel one of the wealthiest women of the 1950s and 1960s.
Wow.
While Chanel had managed to
That's how
rescue
she
a
got
piecemeal
there.
victory from the jaws of defeat when
Amazing.
it came to Parfum Chanel in the years immediately following the end of the Second World War, her own public reputation was severely damaged by her wartime conduct within France.
Oh,
She decided to leave as a result. Already in 1945, once the charges against her were dropped and she was released from a brief imprisonment, she headed with von Dinklage for Switzerland, a nation which had remained neutral throughout the war, and which had the dubious distinction of becoming a haven for many Nazi war criminals during the late 1940s and early 1950s.
wow.
She lived in the town of
Any of this.
Lausanne, on the northern shores of Lac Le Mans, just over 25 kilometers from the eastern border of
I
France,
knew it, but not in
where she
this
was
way.
constantly perturbed by the rise of new fashion
that
houses in France,
way.
Spain, and Italy, such as those of Christian Dior and Cristobal Balenciaga, whose designs Chanel deemed to be far too rigid and conservative in comparison with the House of Chanel's clothing and products in the interwar period of the 1920s and 1930s. Nevertheless, the House of Chanel's reputation was badly damaged by the war, and Coco had little opportunity to revive it through to the mid-1950s. Indeed, as late as 1949, she was called to give testimony in a French court, where she was attacked for her links to the Nazis in the trial of Baron Louis de Vaufreland, a former Nazi intelligence agent. Interestingly, on this occasion, Chanel defended her character by claiming that Duff Cooper, a former British ambassador to France following the liberation of the country in 1944, and a diplomat appointed by Winston Churchill, could provide a character reference for her wartime conduct should it be needed. Exactly what she meant and what Cooper might have revealed remains frustratingly unclear to the present day. There was something of a coda in the early 90s to Chanel's involvement with the Nazis and the in occupied France during the Second World War. After the war had ended, Walter Schellenberg, the chief of foreign intelligence gathering within the SD, and an individual that Chanel had some contact with during the war, though the extent of which cannot be fully determined, was arrested in Germany. Schellenberg was a senior security agent, but he was not implicated in the high-level decision-making that had either fomented the war or led to the Holocaust of Europe's Jews and other genocidal policies, although he clearly had engaged in genocidal activity, not least his involvement in managing the activities of the Einsatzgruppen and death squads on the Eastern Front following the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Nevertheless, he did not stand trial in the first trial of the leaders of the Nazi regime at Nuremberg, from late 1945 onwards. Instead, he stood trial during the ministry's trial of second-tier Nazi ministers in 1948. It appears that Chanel was funneling financial aid to his wife and children during this period of imprisonment. Owing to his having provided extensive evidence on the actions of the SS and the Gestapo, Schellenberg escaped with a sentence of 6 years in prison when judgment was made in 1949. In reality, however, he only served 2 years before being released on health grounds, owing to an ultimately fatal liver condition. After his release, he headed for Switzerland, where he may have been entertained by Coco for a time before ultimately settling in Turin in Italy, where he died in March 1952. When he died, it was Coco Chanel who paid for his funeral and offered further financial support to his widow. There can be few clearer statements of Chanel's sympathies and involvement with the Nazi security services during the Second World War than her continuing support for Schellenberg throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. Chanel was not content to live in quiet retirement in Switzerland for the remainder of her life, even though by the mid-1950s she was entering her early 70s. Moreover, with the intensification of the Cold War in the 1950s and the passage of time since the Nazi era, many people who had collaborated with Hitler and the Third Reich were being reintegrated into society across Europe. Thus, in 1954, Chanel sought to re-establish her fashion house back in France. And in order to do so, she turned to a very peculiar source for financing: her longtime rival and estranged business partner, Pierre Wertheimer. It was Wertheimer who provided the necessary financing for Chanel to launch a new fashion range in 1954, one which was critically lauded across the North American and European fashion worlds, despite continuing reservations in many circles about welcoming Chanel back openly into the world of couture in light of her wartime conduct. In particular, the support of magazines such as Vogue and Life contributed to the rebirth of the House of Chanel and ensured that the company would re-emerge as one of the leading fashion companies of the 1950s and 1960s. The next years were ones of renewed success for Coco Chanel. In 1957, the company won the Fashion Oscar at the Fashion Awards in the city of Dallas in Texas.
I just wanted to say that in all the other documentaries that I've seen on her life, that is very glossed over her wartime years. So this is why I really wanted to cover this tonight because, it has since come out much more recently just how entrenched she was in it. So that's why this documentary is so intriguing to me. But yeah, I just wanted to say that this whole era of her life is one that has always been a mystery to me. So that's why I wanted to cover it so extensively tonight. So this creator did an amazing job with doing that. And all right, I'm not going to keep blah blah blahing, but yeah, I really wanted to get that part of her story. So this is sort of at this point is where her life kind of picks up in other documentaries that I've seen. It sort of has always glossed over her wartime years. So all right, backing it up just a second. Oh, sorry, may have gone too far. Let's go.
Coco Chanel. In 1957, the company won the Fashion Oscar at the Fashion Awards in the city of Dallas in Texas. These were innovative years. For instance, the 1950s saw Chanel move into producing a wide range of jewelry items, while the house's first male fragrance, or eau de toilette, was released in the mid-1950s. 1955 also witnessed the initial release of Chanel's range of leather handbags. The 1960s were a new height for the brand, with Chanel clothing being worn by some of the most prominent women of the era, notably the actresses Jeanne Moreau, Elizabeth Taylor, and Jane Fonda. While in the political world, the wife of President John F. Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, was a keen fan of Chanel. When her husband was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, on the 22nd of November 1963, Jackie's infamous pink suit was a Chanel design. It was most likely the former First Lady who advised her second husband, Aristotle Onassis, to employ Chanel to design the air hostess suits for his airline, Olympic Airways, in the late 1960s. Thus, the brand Chanel's popularity and cultural relevance would ultimately be restored in the decades following World War II. It should be borne in mind that Coco Chanel was intrinsically the chief designer for the company during its second iteration. She no longer controlled it to the same extent as she had in the interwar period. The agreement with Wertheimer for him to finance the relaunch in 1954 had been that the entire label would now be owned in the same manner as Parfums Chanel had been prior to the Second World War. What this meant was that Chanel owned just 10% of the company, with the Wertheimer family holding a 70% controlling stake. Moreover, Pierre acquired the other 20% in the late 1950s, ensuring his family's control over the firm in the decades to come. As Jacques Wertheimer, his son, was effectively becoming the controlling party within the business as Pierre entered semi-retirement. Chanel continued to work into old age. She never considered retirement, residing at the Hotel Ritz, where she had continued to live whenever in Paris since the days of the German occupation of the city in 1940. She was in the midst of preparing the spring catalogue for Chanel in 1971 when the end came. On the afternoon of the 9th of January, she felt ill and went to bed, dying early the next morning. Her funeral was held at the Church of Sainte-Marie-Madeleine in the 8th arrondissement, a grand French church which had been initiated by King Louis XV in the 18th century. The ceremony was attended by many of France's leading fashion, cultural, and political figures, notably Salvador Dali and Yves Saint Laurent. She was buried subsequently in Lausanne in Switzerland, where she had spent many years living in exile after the war. Despite the prominence of the funeral plans, which were led by the First Lady of the country, Claude Pompidou, wife of President Georges Pompidou, there were rumblings in January 1971 and afterwards about Chanel's wartime activities and collaborations with the Nazi security services. Since her death, Chanel's life has been put under the spotlight by numerous extensive studies. While none have debated her success as a fashion designer, her politics and activities during the Second World War have become a matter of serious contention. While several biographies of Chanel tended to lionize her success and her influence over
Yeah.
20th century fashion,
Right.
a biography by Hal Vaughan, published in 2011,
Right.
first offered a major assessment of Chanel's life. This charted her wartime record, her involvement with the SD, her time as a Nazi collaborator, her efforts to prize ownership of Chanel entirely away from the Wertheimer family on account of their Jewish heritage, and her affair with Baron von Dinklage. This book and other studies since have also revealed the manner in which Chanel managed to escape punishment after the war,
Didn't know that
owing to
about
her
her and
contacts within
Churchill.
high society in Britain and France, and her exile in Switzerland in the late 1940s and early 1950s, as she waited for the furore over her public collaboration with the Nazis to die down. This has all been part of a wider process whereby other fashion houses like Hugo Boss have
Wow.
also confronted their links to Nazism in recent decades.
Didn't know that. Wow.
The Chanel
Hugo Boss
company
linked to
continued to go from
Nazism?
strength to strength, following Chanel's own demise. When she died, Chanel's personal estate passed to her nephew, André Pallas, and his daughters, Coco never having had children of her own. But overall ownership of the Chanel company passed to Alain Wertheimer, the grandson of Pierre, Coco's business partner since the 1920s, with whom she had clashed during the war and who had died in 1965.
Okay.
The company was in a period of decline when Alain took over, with sales of Chanel No. 5 down considerably and the brand having lost ground to other designers.
I actually
Under the younger
don't like that
Wertheimer's
fragrance
leadership, a new
at all.
marketing campaign was initiated, and Karl Lagerfeld was brought in as the new creative director of Chanel in 1982.
Yeah.
Lagerfeld is credited with having modernized the brand while retaining much of its tradition as established by Coco herself. In the process, it became one of the world's leading designers and brands once again, with high-end items such as $11,000 dresses and $2,000 leather handbags ratcheting up the firm's profit margins by the 1990s. New products, such as the first Chanel watch, were also launched during these decades. Today, the company is still owned by the Wertheimer family, and in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, has set new records for revenue turnover in excess of $15 billion annually, with 310 boutiques worldwide employing over 20,000 employees. It's a long way from the milliner's shop on the Rue Cambon in Paris, which Coco opened back in 1910. Coco Chanel is one of the most important fashion designers in history. Significantly, she was the only fashion figure to be featured on Time magazine's list of the 100 most influential figures of the 20th century. What is doubly notable about this is that she came from such humble beginnings. She came from an incredibly poor family and was effectively orphaned as a child when her mother died and her father abandoned her, and most of her siblings. Using her connections within high society in Paris, to whom she was introduced by her lovers in the late 1900s and early 1910s, she began building a fashion house which in the 1920s rose to become one of the most significant in France and then Europe. A sign of her success is that products like Chanel No. 5 are still as ubiquitous 100 years later as they were when she first released them. And yet there is another side to Coco Chanel, the woman who was clearly possessed of a pronounced anti-Semitism, who collaborated extensively with the Nazi regime in occupied France during the Second World War, and only narrowly escaped punishment after the liberation of Paris in 1944, likely owing to her connections within British high society. There is no reconciling these two different narratives of her life. She was at once a highly successful fashion designer who has left her imprint on modern history as a result, while also being clearly guilty of collaborating with the forces of Hitler's National Socialism between 1940 and 1944. Fortunately, because the Chanel company passed, following Coco's death, into the hands of the Wertheimer family, a Jewish business dynasty whom Coco had tried to undermine during the war, the company itself is arguably somewhat unstained by Chanel's own dalliances with the Nazis at the time of World War II. What do you think of Coco Chanel? Do her links to the Nazi regime compromise the brand and business today? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
I think that this creator did an amazing job, and of course we got to give him a like. And then of course he's going to finish with his ad. Yeah, I think that they did an amazing job covering the parts of her life that I was unaware of. And I think that, excuse me, I think that it's kind of fascinating to hear all that information that I didn't know. And like I said, I am sort of a history buff and love documentaries. So that was really fun for me to watch that. I think that the next part, what we should do is cover the eras, I believe, of Karl Lagerfeld. So that tie in. Let's see. Hang on one second. Let's get out of here. Go back to our watch. And there is the controversial history of Chanel. I feel, is that going to be redundant? I don't know, you guys. Discovering the life behind the brand. Okay, let's go with this other story, the controversial history. I'll go ahead and start sharing with you guys so you know what I'm talking about here. If it starts to become redundant, we'll end it and move on, because I don't want it to be like, okay, we just watched that whole thing. But this one here, the controversial history of Chanel, it did get 1 million views. So I'm just curious. Again, with Karl Lagerfeld in the photo, I'm hoping it's going to not just cover that all over again. Because I also have this one, Coco Chanel, Nazi Mistress, Addict, Spy, and the World's Most Glamorous Woman. But let's go ahead and start with this one. If it becomes redundant, we'll end it and move on to something else. Because we do have Discovering the Life. And I do want to do her apartment. And I am going to find that one with her and Wallace Simpson, because I'm just curious. But you see right here, I've got the life and death of Elsa Schiaparelli. So that is another one that we could definitely cover. And it's 2.5 hours. So it will be just that one. And it was literally only 4 weeks ago from the same creator that I did with the Alexander McQueen. She did such good coverage, and I really do want to watch that one. So maybe we'll do that one next week. I don't know. Leave in the comments to let me know which one of these you guys want to do next weekend. And we're going to go ahead and get this one started. Again, I just wanted to, use up the time.
The
It seems
history
like
of Chanel.
when we do this long for a movie night, it seems to be doing really well. It gets a lot of views. So we're going to go ahead, see what it's like. Again, if it becomes redundant, we'll just end it. It looks like there's a lot of modern stuff in here. So that's what I really want to feature. Okay, backing it up. So of course, always give love to the creators that I am showing in my movies. And speaking of which, I need to go back into history and make sure that I am crediting all of the creators that I'm using. Got to do that. All right, let's get going. Let's get going. And as you can see, I need to get my mask off. So I'm going to do that. I might miss the beginning of this, but I'll be back in just a couple of minutes.
The history of Chanel. Even if you know nothing about fashion, there's one brand whose name you're bound to recognize: Chanel. With an iconic perfume that's been worn by the likes of Marilyn Monroe, and tweed two-piece sets that have been duped to high heaven, and purses that get more and more expensive with each passing year, it's clear that the 100-year-old brand is not only a household name, but a staple of the high fashion world. But did you know that that wasn't always the case? In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the iconic fashion house's history over the past century, from founder Coco Chanel's time as a Nazi collaborator, to the creation of the brand's signature products, to Karl Lagerfeld's controversial 80s relaunch, to the increasingly poor reception it's received in the last few
Okay,
years.
good. This is going to
Let's
be
get into
good.
it.
This is going to be good.
Gabrielle Bonheur Chanel,
All right.
more commonly
go
known
watch
by
this
her
stuff. I'll be
nickname
back.
Coco, was born in Saumur, France on August 19, 1883. Gabrielle's home life was complicated and difficult, with her mother often being ill and her father frequently traveling in order to peddle his wares. And this neglect was epitomized by her now well-known last name being misspelled as Chanel on her birth certificate. Following the death of her mother at the age of 11 and the subsequent abandonment of her father, she and her 3 sisters were placed in the custody of the Sister of the Sacred Heart in Aubazine, a convent with an affiliated orphanage. Her life at the orphanage was arduous and demanding, but it also inadvertently contributed to her future career as it was where she first learned how to sew. After turning 18 in 1901, Gabrielle left the convent and moved to Moulins, where she worked as a sales assistant and seamstress at Maison Grand-Père during the day, and in the evening moonlighted as a cabaret singer. It's rumored that one of her signature songs, Qui Croit-vous Coco, served as the inspiration behind her famous nickname, although others have said it stemmed from the French word cocotte, meaning kept woman. While working at the cabaret, she met Etienne de Balzan, the son of a textile entrepreneur, and she eventually became his mistress, living with him in his chateau for several years. Because of Balzan's wealth and high social standing, Gabrielle was able to meet the creme de la creme of French society, allowing her to make the sophisticated and influential connections that would serve her well in the future. In 1908, Gabrielle entered an affair with Arthur Capel, a wealthy member of the English upper class, who later moved Gabrielle to an apartment in Paris. She had begun designing hats while living with Balzan, but after the hobby proved fruitful, she became a licensed milliner in 1910, and along with her lover's financial backing, opened her first hat boutique at 21 Rue Cambon under the name Chanel Mode. At the time, women's headwear, which signified that you weren't a part of the working class, was elaborate and bulky, something Gabrielle once admonished, saying, quote, "How could women think with such a thing on their heads?" By emphasizing subtlety and simplicity with a single ribbon or feather on a wide brim hat, Gabrielle's designs were a welcome subversion of the norm, with the designer saying, quote, "Simplicity is the keynote of any true elegance." This venture was a success amongst Balzan's social circle, but eventually became a citywide phenomenon after the well-known French actress Gabrielle Dorzat wore one of Gabrielle's hats while performing on stage in 1912. In the wake of this popularity, Gabrielle decided to expand her business, moving to Deauville with Capel in 1913, where she opened another boutique which sold her signature hats, as well as luxury clothing suitable for leisure and sport. Taking inspiration from the lavish seaside resort, Gabrielle began selling fisherman-inspired striped jersey blouses, with both the design and material being more comfortable than the stiff fashions that were popular during the Belle Epoque period. Up until that point, jersey had been primarily used for men's underwear, and by incorporating the material into her designs, Gabrielle's clothing was both surprising and sensual. Gabrielle enlisted her sister Antoinette and her paternal aunt Adrienne to model these designs, and the 2 women paraded around town in these Chanel creations as a form of advertising. With its hobble skirts, corsets, and layers upon layers of fabric, Edwardian fashion was as restrictive as it was extravagant. But Gabrielle's designs were the opposite, being simple, relaxed, and ironically enough, affordable. And this casually chic style became a staple of the brand. With women beginning to see more freedoms and liberties, Gabrielle's comfortable ensembles captured the spirit of the times, and she was credited for breathing a new life into the French fashion scene, with Harper's Bazaar raving over the brand in 1915, quote, "The woman who hasn't at least one Chanel is hopelessly out of fashion." Having gained prominence for her sporty silhouettes amongst the fashionable French elite, Gabrielle opened her first couture house in Biarritz in 1916. After hiring 300 workers, she released her first haute couture collection, which featured uncluttered styles, boxy lines, and shorter skirts. That same year, Maison Rodier became the exclusive manufacturer of Gabrielle's signature jersey material, with the elastic fabric helping her achieve the soft, flowing lines that were necessary to emphasize a woman's natural shape, which happened to coincide with the diminishing popularity of corsets. And unlike many other textiles which were in short supply because of World War I, jersey remained accessible and affordable. This Biarritz shop proved to be so lucrative that after a single year, she was able to reimburse Arthur Capel on his original investment, and also purchase another location at 31 Rue de Cambon in Paris, her largest thus far, which housed a boutique, salon, workshops, and atelier, and serves as the brand's headquarters to this day. Having already made a name for herself as a fashion rebel, Gabrielle was one of the earliest designers to begin making trousers for women, producing sailor pants and beach pajamas in the late 1910s, which combined traditionally feminine motifs like pearls and flowers with masculine fabrics and silhouettes. This was considered quite the risque move, as the scandalous silhouette was associated with the bedroom. But by the mid-1920s, they had become a staple amongst wealthy ladies and a fixture of the Chanel brand.
You guys
Gabrielle
okay?
was not only a designer, but a trendsetter, with her independent lifestyle serving as an example of the modern woman. While her bobbed hair and practical designs helped make the androgynous garçon style a staple of the Roaring Twenties.
Oh, yeah.
The garçon style, or tomboy style, took its name from Victor Marguerite's
little
1922 novel, Le Garçon, which featured a female protagonist who wore men's clothes, slept with both men and women, and sought out her own career. The look, much like the book itself, was rather controversial.
Sorry, guys. I just had to get all that mask off, and it does take some time. I hope you guys are enjoying it. I just wanted to check in. I don't want to stop the movie for you, but just wanted to let you know why I was off camera for so long. But I finally got that mask off. I'm getting ready to put on another. Backing it up a second. Here we go.
Style, or tomboy style, took its name from Victor Marguerite's 1922 novel, Le Garçon, which featured a female protagonist who wore men's clothes, slept with both men and women, and sought out her own career. The look, much like the book itself, was rather controversial, so it was inevitable that the rebellious House of Chanel would embrace the style. The garçon coincided with the popularity of the slim and petite gamine body type, which Gabrielle had, and her designs were often made to complement this boyish frame. This worked in her favor during the 1920s, as gamine was en vogue, and many of her most iconic designs that were introduced during this time period, like her two-piece sets, had a slightly boxy silhouette that was seen as flattering on that sort of figure. Said sets were supposedly inspired by the suits worn by her lover at the time, the Duke of Westminster, continuing the Chanel trend of mixing the feminine with masculine. Gabrielle's designs often took inspiration from her personal life, with her childhood spent at the convent being cited as an influence on the Chanel aesthetic, with the designer's contrasting lines and frequent use of black and white being interpreted as an ode to a nun's habit. Her lover, Arthur Capel, also served as her muse throughout her career. A polo player with a penchant for well-tailored clothing, Capel's sartorial suits were the inspiration behind the masculine elements in Gabrielle's early designs, not to mention her usage of jersey. His death in a car accident in 1919, which occurred while he was on the way to visit Gabrielle, thrust her into a years-long grieving period, saying later in life, quote, "His death was a terrible blow to me. In losing Capel, I lost everything. What followed was not a life of happiness, I have to say." In the wake of his passing, the designer frequently wore black, something that eventually led to the creation of her little black dress in 1926, with the simple design being referred to by Vogue as the, quote, Chanel Ford, the frock all the world will wear. If you want to learn more about the history of the little black dress in general, make sure to check out our video all about it.
Okay.
Working in collaboration with
Make
famed
sure that
chemist
you
and
work with
perfumer
this
Ernest Beau,
collaborator.
Gabrielle
Give us
created
some
the
love.
brand's first perfume, Chanel No. 5, in 1922. The prominent placement of the Chanel name ensured that the perfume would be immediately linked to the house's identity, while the number itself had a hidden meaning, with Gabrielle saying, quote, "I show my collections on the 5th of May, the 5th month of the year, and this number 5 will bring it good luck." Funnily enough, Chanel still presents their collections on the 5th of the month.
Which the
During
other
that time period,
creator had a
perfumes that
totally
were heavy
different
with amber
story.
musk or jasmine were associated with women of the night. But Gabrielle wanted a scent that would appeal to the liberated feminine spirit of the 1920s and reject society's ideas about respectable women. Ernest Beau initially hesitated at Gabrielle's choice because the perfume's 80 ingredients and signature jasmine scent was quite costly, to which she responded, quote, "In that case, add more of it. I want to create the most expensive perfume in the world." Arthur Capel's toiletry bottles and whiskey decanter have been credited as the influence behind the perfume's unique look, with its sleek and simple square design helping with the product's longevity and recognizability. In 1924, Gabrielle made an agreement with Pierre and Paul Wertheimer, the directors of the perfume and cosmetics house Bourjois, to create the entity Parfum Chanel, with the Wertheimers agreeing to provide full financing for the production, marketing, and distribution of Chanel No. 5, as well as other Chanel-branded perfumes, cosmetics, and skincare products. They received 70% of the profits from this successful venture, while Gabrielle, who had licensed her name and withdrawn involvement in business operations, received 10%. Unhappy with the arrangement, even attempting to renegotiate the original deal, Gabrielle once called Pierre Wertheimer, quote, the bandit who screwed me. And she spent decades fighting for full control of Parfum Chanel. But we'll get back to that. Inspired by the opulent jewelry given to her by her various aristocratic lovers, in the 1930s, Gabrielle recruited Count Etienne de Beaumont and Duke Folco de Verdana to open an atelier completely dedicated to costume jewelry, which is something still heavily utilized in the brand's aesthetic today. While some of these initial jewelry collections were more high-end, featuring precious gems and expensive metals, by the end of the decade they began incorporating faux pearls and stones. These coveted, yet technically cheap pieces were worn by Gabrielle herself, who once said, quote, "Jewelry is junk and should be worn that way. It should be worn merely because it is interesting or decorative and never with an eye to its value." Because most of Chanel's garments were
I didn't know that
understated,
quote.
these
That's
eye-catching
great.
accessories helped elevate the ensemble
I
and
love
create
an
balance.
accessory.
And the popularity of their faux necklaces and brooches helped rid costume jewelry of the negative connotation it had developed following the Great Depression. In 1930, the French designer traveled to Hollywood, where she met MGM producer Samuel Goldwyn, who requested that she costume 1931's Tonight or Never and 1932's The Greeks Had a Word for Them. This arrangement was beneficial for both parties. On Goldwyn's end, he was able to tie his leading ladies to the Chanel brand, which had a reputation of being fashionable and elegant, while Gabrielle was able to introduce her designs to an even wider audience and develop a relationship with the influential Hollywood elite. It was around this time period that Gabrielle began to heavily incorporate the camellia flower into different Chanel products, from jewelry to dresses, and it's since become as synonymous with the brand as its interlocking C logo.
Very
Rumored to be her
interesting.
favorite
The
flower,
other
camellias
creator
adorned the
didn't
designer's
cover.
coffin, along with orchids, azaleas, and gardenias. Gardenias were another frequent Chanel motif, with the scent even making its way into perfume. In the wake of World War II, Gabrielle shut the doors of multiple Chanel shops. As a result of this closure, 4,000 female employees lost their jobs, with some suggesting that Gabrielle had used the war as an opportunity to retaliate against the employees who had striked for higher wages and shorter work hours a few years earlier. Although there was no clientele for couture at the time, demand for Chanel goods was still high, as many American soldiers were tasked with the job of purchasing perfumes and accessories as souvenirs for their spouses and mothers back home. Although there was almost no Chanel print advertising at this time, the fragrance's sales flourished, increasing tenfold between 1940 and 1945, amounting to $9 million annually, which is over $150 million today. Following the Nazi occupation of France in 1940, Gabrielle immediately sought refuge in the Hotel Ritz, which was also used as the headquarters of the German military. While there, she met Hans Gunther von Dinklage, who worked alongside the German embassy and was believed to be a Gestapo spy. Although Gabrielle's romantic liaisons had been hot gossip for decades, and her anti-Semitic views had been well documented, this affair brought up suspicions of Nazi involvement, and evidence has since been uncovered of both her agent number and code name. Besides her long-held prejudices towards Jewish people, Gabrielle is believed to have been incentivized to partner up with the Germans because of her long-standing feud with the Wertheimers over Parfum Chanel. With the Nazis seizing all Jewish-owned property and businesses, Gabrielle had the perfect opportunity to regain control of the entity, and more specifically, its most profitable product, Chanel No. 5. Because the Wertheimers were Jewish, Gabrielle attempted to use her position as an Aryan and Nazi informer to petition German officials to legalize her right to sole ownership, writing in a letter in May 1941, quote, "Parfum Chanel is still the property of Jews and has been legally abandoned by the owners. I have an indisputable right of priority. The profits that I have received from my creation since the foundations of this business are disproportionate. You can help to repair in part the prejudices I've suffered in the course of these 17 years. What she didn't know was that the
See, now we
Wertheimers,
get
who had
the
anticipated the
actual
Nazi
letter
seizures
in
and
this
fled to
one.
America,
Wow.
had legally turned control of Parfum Chanel over to the Christian
Which
French
the other
businessman
creator
Felix
didn't cover.
Amiot the year
So
prior,
this is good.
thwarting
This is
Gabrielle's
good. We're
attempts
getting
at
a little
reclaiming the company.
more
Amiot
information
later
as we go.
returned the company to the Wertheimers following the war, and the family is still the controlling shareholder of Chanel to this day. At the end of World War II, Gabrielle's wartime activities led to her eventual arrest, and she was interrogated by the Free French Purge Committee. But without any documented evidence or witnesses, she was eventually released. Many believe that her punishment was secretly intervened by then Prime Minister of the UK, Winston Churchill, who Gabrielle had first befriended in the 1920s when she was involved with the Duke of Westminster. Despite going free, Gabrielle's reputation was severely damaged, and she went into an 8-year exile in Switzerland after determining that it was no longer safe for her to remain in France. Still upset about what she deemed to be an unjust business dealing, Gabrielle established a Swiss parfumery to create, produce, and sell her Chanel perfumes. And she claimed that the Chanel No. 5 sold by the Wertheimers was no longer the authentic fragrance created by Mademoiselle Chanel. Seeing their business interests threatened, Pierre Wertheimer set out to settle his quarrel with Gabrielle. And in May 1947, they renegotiated the 1924 contract that had established Parfum Chanel. She was ultimately awarded $400,000 in cash for the wartime profits from the sale of the perfume, a running 2% royalty on all sales of Chanel No. 5, and a monthly stipend that paid all of her living expenses, no matter how big or small. This arrangement made her the richest woman in the world at the time. In exchange, Gabrielle closed her Swiss parfumery and sold the full rights to the name Coco Chanel. By the 1950s, the Chanel brand was better known for its perfume than its clothing, as Gabrielle's couture house had remained closed throughout the war and her exile. Besides being immortalized in the artwork of Salvador Dali and Andy Warhol, the fragrance was also a famous favorite of actress Marilyn Monroe, who once quipped in an interview that she wore 5 drops of Chanel No. 5 to bed and nothing else, and was later photographed applying the perfume in a series of portraits. You'd have to pay for that sort of advertising today, but funnily enough, Chanel didn't. That's how popular it was. During Chanel's heyday in the 1920s and 30s, female designers had been at the forefront of the fashion industry, but men had seized the post-war market, with Christian Dior famously achieving success with his glamorous new look.
We want to cover him
Hyper-feminine
too.
with structured silhouettes, cinched waists, and layers upon layers of fabric, these Dior designs were the antithesis of Gabrielle's style philosophy of understated elegance, and she was vocal about her displeasure with this aspect of post-war era fashion, saying, quote, "Look how ridiculous these women are, wearing clothes by a man who doesn't know women, never had one, and dreams of being one." Yes, she was homophobic as well as an anti-Semite. Her
Wow,
distaste for
didn't know
Dior's
that.
designs and the designs of his male contemporaries inspired her to get out of retirement at the age of 71, and she sought to reopen the House of Chanel. Fully funded by the Wertheimers, who were granted commercial rights to all Chanel brand products, Gabrielle released her comeback collection in 1954. The collection received mixed to negative reviews from the French press, not only because many were still upset with the designer's war activities, but also because they interpreted the collection as conservative and derivative of her past work. Stateside, the collection was more polarizing. Some proclaimed it a breakthrough, with their stance on the matter likely having to do with many Americans being displeased with Dior's new look, with his designs even sparking protests across the country. But some critics questioned whether or not Chanel could make it in a post-war era, with the Miami News saying, quote, "Let old-timers shed a nostalgic tear. Coco's creations are not for 1954. Her long skirts, down to the bottom of the calf, and ill-fitted waist reminiscent of the 1930s are foreign to the modern eye." Although the brand's comeback had a rather rough start, with some even saying that the veteran fashion house should stick to perfume, Gabrielle was able to prove the naysayers wrong by releasing 2 new products that would eventually become Chanel staples. The 255 handbag, also known as the classic flat bag, was first created by Gabrielle in the 1920s, before updating the design in 1955. The 255 was the first luxury bag for women to come with a shoulder strap, as earlier clutches needed to be carried by hand. And the purse also came with several pockets with specific functions like holding lipstick or money. Although these seem like obvious inclusions today, at the time they were groundbreaking innovations, and by offering women a hands-free option that was functional and fashionable, it was a rousing success that effectively transformed the way all
Like
women's
having a
bags
cell
were
phone
designed
pocket
from
in
that
your
point
purse.
onward. Unlike most creatives, Gabrielle was flattered by the idea that others wanted to copy her designs, once saying, quote, "Being plagiarized is the greatest compliment one can receive." In 1957, the first Chanel two-tone shoe was released, which had a less than 2-inch heel and an elastic strap, once again tying into the brand's comfortable yet elegant philosophy, with Gabrielle saying, quote, "It isn't a matter of art, not at all. It's like architecture. It has to be practical first, and the most important element is good taste." Initially introduced in black and beige, these slingback heels were eventually released in a wide color palette, and were dubbed Cinderella's new slipper by the press. By adding these shoes to the Chanel roster of little black dresses, quilted flat bags, perfume, tweed jackets, and 2-piece sets, the signature Chanel look that was loved by celebrities and socialites was complete, with many of the items being touted as timeless wardrobe essentials even to this day. Gabrielle had long been the face of Chanel, but as she was now older with a controversial past, in the 1950s they decided to seek out their first brand ambassadors, women who not only epitomized the Chanel look, but had the personality and charisma to match. For the 1954 comeback collection, Marie-Hélène Arnaud was tapped as one of these exclusive house models for Chanel and was featured prominently in the brand's print advertising and runway shows throughout the decade, eventually replacing Gabrielle as the face of Chanel. Arnaud became Gabrielle's muse, with some critics even referring to her as Gabrielle's alter ego, and the two spent a significant amount of time together, with Arnaud even moving into an apartment on the same street as the Chanel atelier. American actress Susie Parker developed a similar relationship with the brand, although she was never as unanimously associated with Chanel as Arnaud was, but she and Gabrielle grew quite close, with Parker even naming her daughter after the designer. Because of Gabrielle's close relationship with these women, rumors arose of them being lovers, something that many modern-day historians have denied, with Justine Picardi, author of the biography Coco Chanel, The Legend and the Life, saying the dynamic was, quote, a curious mixture of mothering and mentoring, rather than anything truly sexual. The House of Chanel remained popular throughout the 1960s, with several actresses, including Romy Schneider, Jeanne Moreau, Jane Fonda, Catherine Deneuve, and Brigitte Bardot, eventually becoming affiliated with the brand. Schneider, who had befriended Gabrielle, was even dressed in Chanel for the 1962 movie Boccaccio 70, while Deneuve was the spokesmodel for Chanel No. 5 throughout the 1970s. Former First Lady Jackie Kennedy also had a fondness for the brand, often wearing Chanel or its authorized counterfeits over the course of the decade. This included the infamous pink suit that she wore in 1963 when her husband was assassinated, which made the Chanel suit one of the most recognizable pieces of clothing of the era. In 1971, at the age of 87, Gabrielle Coco Chanel passed away, and having not named a successor, the fashion world wondered what the future had in store for the House of Chanel. After her death, Yvonne Dudel, Jean Casaubon, and Philippe Gaulbourget began designing for the fashion house. Dudel and Casaubon were responsible for the haute couture line, while Guy Bourget was credited as the creator of the brand's first ready-to-wear collection in 1977. With different designers, the two lines lacked consistency, with Guy Bourget saying, quote, it was difficult to keep the look, but not to repeat it exactly. And this further weakened Chanel's brand identity, and some fans even complained that the ready-to-wear line made the brand lose its mystique because it was becoming too affordable and accessible. The couture line was frequently criticized for being behind the times, with complaints being directed towards the lack of creativity and originality, with many critics pointing out that they were near-exact copies of Gabrielle's previous designs. By the end of the decade, Chanel was in serious decline, with the only notable public figure who still wore the brand being Nancy Reagan, a far cry from the trendy ambassadors of prior decades. And by the early 80s, Chanel's accessories, cosmetics, and fragrances were the only things standing between them and bankruptcy. In 1983, more than a decade after Gabrielle's passing, Chanel's owner, Alan Wertheimer, named Karl Lagerfeld as the artistic director of Chanel, which was probably one of the greatest hiring decisions of all time. Born in Hamburg, Germany in 1933, Lagerfeld managed to come out of World War II largely unscathed thanks to his father's business dealings, and he and his two older sisters had a relatively comfortable childhood. When he was 14, the family relocated to Paris, and while studying art and history, he discovered his
Very
passion for
controversial
fashion.
figure.
In 1955, he met Pierre Balmain, who he worked for as an assistant, then
We're
an
going to
apprentice.
cover Balmain
And by the
also.
mid-1960s, he was designing freelance for a multitude of brands, including Chloe and Valentino, before eventually being hired by Fendi in 1965, which at the time was effectively a family business known for its fur and leather goods. In 1966, Lagerfeld created the company's double F logo and was named the creative director for fur, with these designs being considered innovative and modern. He also led the charge when the company decided to introduce clothing, with Lagerfeld becoming the creative director of the women's ready-to-wear line, which launched in 1977. His work at Fendi made them a formidable force in fashion, and is credited for helping the company break into the US and Japanese markets.
For those of you
Tying
that
with
don't
Yves Saint
know,
Laurent as one of the most influential designers of the era, Lagerfeld's resume
Lagerfeld
proved that he
and
had what it
Fendi.
took to bring a brand into the modern era, making him the perfect person to fix the floundering house of Chanel. As mentioned, by the 1980s, the brand was hanging on by a thread, but Lagerfeld leapt at the opportunity to bring it back to life, once telling the New York Times, quote, everybody said, don't touch it, it's dead, it will never come back. But by then, I thought it was a challenge. Of course, his salary of $1 million per collection no doubt helped ease any worries. Although Lagerfeld had made a name for
Per
himself with his
collection.
avant-garde designs,
And they do
for his
like
debut
6
Chanel
collections
Couture
a
collection
season.
in 1983, he showed restraint, with the designer opting to simply reinterpret the brand's most identifiable motifs through a contemporary lens. This was praised by critics, with Bootsy Galbraith saying, quote, "If Mademoiselle had been sitting at the top of the staircase today, I think she would have been very happy. It's a wonderful collection and in the Chanel tradition down to the last detail." Fashion designer Sonia Reichel shared a similar sentiment, quote, "I take my hat off to him. It was a very beautiful collection and it is a real homage to Chanel. It was full of respect for what she did, with some evidence of sliding towards something else." These early collections were inspired by the brand's heyday in the 1920s and 30s, with Lagerfeld saying, quote, "Everyone remembers the typical Chanel suit she did in the 50s, but I like to remember the work she did when she was young in the 20s. Although Lagerfeld was praised by critics for this unique understanding of the modern-day consumer, his designs were poorly received by Chanel's long-standing clients who thought that they were too contemporary. Lagerfeld continued revamping Chanel by taking over the ready-to-wear line the following year and reimagining the brand's 255 handbag. He also began integrating the interlocked CC monograph into his designs, which has since become a staple of Chanel's iconography. Although he stayed loyal to the classic Chanel look throughout the 80s, incorporating tweed, chains, pearls, quilting, camellias, neutral colors, and skirt sets, in the 90s he became far more experimental. In a sharp juxtaposition from the minimalist designs Gabrielle Chanel was known for, Lagerfeld upped the brand's sex appeal and femininity with plunging necklines, sheer fabrics, tight dresses, higher heels, neon colors, and short hems. Something I personally think Gabrielle Chanel would have despised, with the designer once saying, quote, "The knee will not be shown here. The knee is a joint. Do you think that should be shown? A knee? A miserable knee?" Lagerfeld openly disagreed with his predecessor about the matter, saying, quote, "Chanel killed herself when she said that miniskirts were revolting. When she was young, she took the jersey used for underwear and made it into dresses, which in those days was quite extreme as the miniskirt in the 60s. So why should she establish a standard for what is elegant for the rest of time? What a bore." Gabrielle's famous saying, "Before you leave the house, look in the mirror and take one thing off," also went against Lagerfeld's design sensibilities, with his Chanel collections from the 90s being known for their extravagance and over-accessorizing. Many of Lagerfeld's designs from this time period took inspiration from black streetwear, with bucket hats, denim, large chains, tracksuits, sneakers, and rainbow hair extensions hitting the runway, as well as his sudden use of logomania, which was pioneered by designer Dapper Dan the decade prior. This inspiration didn't go unnoticed by the media, with The Independent reporting in 1993, quote, "All the signs are that Lagerfeld, who is said to spend a lot of time watching MTV in any one of the splendid 18th century residences he has acquired, has lost the plot. Looking at MTV, you can understand why. Black rappers with their oversized clothes, heavy gold chains, seem to have become muddled in his creative mind with the old Chanel. The street has given Lagerfeld just a touch of inspiration. This time it seems to have overwhelmed him as he has attempted to translate young black style into fashion for the bourgeois white customer." These changes to Chanel's classic silhouette further alienated their existing clientele and were even disapproved of by critics, with one publication saying, quote, "It can't be easy to design for a line that had its heyday in the 1980s. That could be the problem for Chanel designer Karl Lagerfeld, who seems to be so relentlessly focused on proving himself a master of modern design that he has forgotten that Chanel customers want dependable clothes with a hint of new trends. Instead, he has given them little else but trends. Asymmetrical hems, techno fabrics, double-layer garments, loose-side accessories.
The brand they
But
are
by
today.
that point, it didn't actually matter what they thought, as Lagerfeld had already succeeded in breathing a new life into the brand, which brought with it new buyers. The designer himself didn't seem to take the criticisms to heart, saying, quote, "What I do, Coco would have hated. The label has an image and it's up to me to update it. I do what she never did. I had to find my mark. I had to go from what Chanel was to what it should be, could be, what it had been to something else." Funnily enough, despite how it was received at the time, this is probably the era of Chanel that is most fondly remembered today. While Chanel No. 5 remained popular, with actress Carole Bouquet becoming the face of the perfume since the mid-80s, handbags had grown to become one of the brand's most popular and profitable products, and they were even carried by Princess Diana, who Lagerfeld later named a handbag after. With accessories becoming such a lucrative part of Chanel's business, in 1987 the brand introduced its first line of watches, which paid homage to the shape of their perfume bottle, and they eventually released the J12 in 1999, which was praised for being the first truly unisex watch. Just as Gabrielle had done back in the 1950s, Lagerfeld built up a collection of model muses, which included familiar faces like Naomi Campbell, Cindy Crawford, Helena Christensen, Kate Moss, Linda Evangelista, Devon Aoki, Claudia Schiffer, and Amber Valletta, who all epitomized his vision of the modern Chanel woman. Besides making regular appearances on the catwalk, these models were also featured in multiple advertising campaigns, although only one was seen as the new face of Chanel. Model Claudia Schiffer was actually discovered by Lagerfeld at the age of 19, with the designer persuading her to make her runway debut with Chanel. Schiffer was an instant success, becoming one of the most famous models of the era, but she never forgot where she got her start, and she opened and closed multiple Chanel shows over the course of the decade, having the honor of being a Chanel bride a whopping 11 times. As Chanel moved into the 2000s, Lagerfeld continued to expand the brand, releasing the first cruise collection that year, which has since become a regular event. In 2001, Kate Moss became the face of Chanel's new perfume, Coco Mademoiselle, which was intended to appeal to a younger generation. With her short dark pixie cut, a hairstyle Moss isn't typically associated with, it was a clear callback to the brand's founder, as well as the gamine style that Chanel had initially found success catering to. In 2004, Nicole Kidman was selected as the brand ambassador for their more grown-up fragrance, Chanel No. 5. The commercial was directed by Baz Luhrmann, but also worked with Kidman on 2001's Moulin Rouge. And when Kidman received her first Oscar nomination for Best Actress for the movie, she not so coincidentally attended the high-profile event in a Chanel gown. After linking up with the brand officially in 2004, she would be spotted in Chanel regularly, an expectation they had of all of their brand ambassadors. Lagerfeld's Chanel shows became known for their theatricality, with the designer presenting his collections in various settings like cruise ships, airport runways, forests, ski resorts, and indoor beaches. And the grandeur of these collections highlighted his style philosophy. In 2005, Chanel had their first show at the Grand Palais in Paris for their 2006 Spring-Summer Ready-to-Wear collection, which started a years-long partnership between the brand and the historic location, resulting in some of their most extravagant shows to date. That same year, the House of Chanel was a sponsor of and theme of the annual Met Gala, with Karl Lagerfeld and Nicole Kidman being co-chairs. Caroline, Princess of Hanover, the eldest child of Princess Grace Kelly of Monaco, was an honorary chair, a decision that paid homage to her mother's past relationship with the Chanel brand. Princess Caroline's daughter, Charlotte, would later be made a Chanel ambassador in 2020. Yes, Chanel likes to keep it in the family. In 2006, actress Keira Knightley was named the new celebrity face for Coco Mademoiselle, replacing Kate Moss, who was dealing with a drug scandal at the time. And the brand's switch to Hollywood actresses was a reflection of the cultural zeitgeist. Knightley starred in numerous Chanel commercials, including a short film directed by Lagerfeld himself, where she played a fictionalized version of the brand's founder. The actress frequently wore Chanel, even to her wedding, and was loaned $2 million worth of pearls for the 2012 adaptation of Anna Karenina. I personally think Knightley is one of their best celebrity ambassadors to date, as she seemed to embody many of the attributes of the brand's identity, having a casual elegance that played well with their aesthetic.
Let's see if this creator covers it.
Having a relationship with Hollywood that then spanned more than 7 decades, Chanel products made appearances in multiple movies and shows. In the original Sex and the City, a show with a massive fan base that was Chanel's exact demographic, Samantha Jones was often spotted in Chanel. And with the character epitomizing the modern career woman who was unashamed of her sexuality, it solidified that Chanel was no longer the brand for uptight grannies. This product placement continued in the subsequent movies, although Carrie Bradshaw, the main character, began wearing it more than Samantha. Chanel also appeared on the popular teen drama The O.C. as a direct result of actress Misha Barton, who played Marissa Cooper. An it girl of the 2000s, Barton was known for her feminine fashion sense, with Chanel dresses, jackets, and handbags making frequent appearances in her wardrobe. And in 2008, Karl Lagerfeld even presented the actress with an InStyle Icon of the Year award. Often styling herself for the show, Barton called in a favor to Chanel, saying, quote, "I started having these designers send stuff over because I saw the merit in getting that kind of stuff on television. If I had those connections in the fashion world, why not? The wardrobe department would totally have been happy just dressing us as regular teenagers, to be honest. Not in a bad way, we would have looked adorable, but we would have been your average Orange County teenagers." The character's high fashion wardrobe made her the envy of every other teenage girl, in real life as well as in the show. And for some millennials, Marissa Cooper was their introduction to Chanel. Chanel also made multiple appearances in 2006's The Devil Wears Prada, with Andrea Sachs directly referencing the brand during her makeover.
Okay, now Chanel, you're in desperate need of Chanel. Are you wearing the Chanel boots?
Yeah, I am.
And the character sports various Chanel
Iconic.
dresses, shoes, hats, and necklaces over the course of the film. It always surprised me that Anne Hathaway was never tapped to become a Chanel girl following the release of the movie, because I remember thinking that
That's a
she
good
made
point.
it look so cool.
Yeah.
With this sort of
She
product
did.
placement working in their favor,
Speak
Chanel
for
was
us,
one of the first fashion brands to send clothing to Gossip Girl. A challenge.
Never
Season
watched
1,
that.
we didn't have many designers participating. Then I feel like something happened between Season 1 and Season 2. At that moment, when we came back, bigger designers were very interested in working with us. Once we got one of the bigger designers to say yes, it was like letting the floodgates open. And early on, Chanel said yes. All of a sudden, everyone wanted to be a part of it. With the clothing in Gossip Girl being as much a main character as Blair Waldorf or Serena van der Woodsen, Chanel was able to position itself not only as a brand for the rich and famous, but for the young and beautiful.
Just so you know, I was never into Gossip Girl, and I tried to get into it just for the fashion. And I'm like, I'm just too old for this high school level of drama. So I tried, I couldn't get into it. Let's keep going.
Although Leighton Meester resembled more of the previous brand ambassadors, it was co-star Blake Lively who developed a friendship with Lagerfeld, who once described her as an
Love her.
American dream girl, and they even attended the Met Gala together, and she eventually became the face of their iconic handbags in the early 2010s. With the brand seeing a huge
Love that
burst of
she's with-
popularity during the 2000s, the life of its founder caught Hollywood's attention, and a handful of films were released, beginning with the made-for-TV movie Coco Chanel in 2008. This was followed by 2009's Coco Chanel and Igor Stravinsky, which follows the rumored affair between the famous designer and composer.
Love
Lagerfeld
Shirley
was in
MacLaine
support
and
of this
anything.
production and granted access to Chanel's archives, as well as the designer's apartment on 31 Rue de Cambon. In 2009, the biopic Coco Before Chanel, likely the most well-known of all the films, was released. Starring brand ambassador Audrey Tautou as Gabrielle Chanel, the film focused on the designer's humble beginnings, love affairs, and early work.
Saw it.
All of these projects conveniently exclude her Nazi activities and political views,
Exactly,
instead
which is why I
romanticizing
didn't
her
know
life
about
and
it.
allowing her public image to remain untarnished.
Exactly.
Throughout the 2010s,
That's why
Lagerfeld
we
began
covered
picking
it
up new
tonight.
muses, starting with model Cara Delevingne. First walking for Chanel's 2012 Fall-Winter Haute Couture show, Delevingne and Lagerfeld immediately took a shine to one another, with the designer once saying, quote, "Cara is different. She's full of life, full of pep. I like girls to be wild, but at the same time beautifully brought up and very funny." After appearing on multiple Chanel runways, Delevingne was eventually announced as a new face of Chanel in 2014. Around this time, we saw a slew of teenage Chanel girls, with Lily Rose Depp being announced as a brand ambassador in 2015, Willow Smith in 2016, and Kaya Gerber in 2017. Interestingly, both Gerber and Depp were Chanel Nepo babies, with their mothers famously serving as Lagerfeld's muses in the 90s. Although they've all appeared in various campaigns, with Willow Smith genuinely making me consider a Chanel purchase, Depp seems to have maintained the closest relationship with the brand, often walking the Chanel runway and wearing their dresses to various high-profile events. I think this may have to do with Depp being a gamine, the ultimate Chanel body type, so she's able to pull off some of the house's less flattering designs. Although the brand was more popular than ever, the 2010s are where we began to see some of their weaker design efforts, especially on red carpets, with many of their celebrity ambassadors being hit by what is colloquially referred to as the Chanel contract curse. One of the most notable being Kristen Stewart, who befriended Lagerfeld in 2017. Known for her slightly androgynous style, on paper, Stewart seemed like an excellent fit for a brand that had first become famous for rejecting traditional femininity. But Lagerfeld seemed to struggle with the balance, with the actress often looking like she was wearing a knockoff of the brand she was a face of. Miley
was
Cyrus
so
was also
shocked
spotted in
when they
Chanel
made her the
frequently throughout the
face.
decade, but as a singer with a clearly defined look for each era, she integrated the designs into her wardrobe
Not a
in a way
Miley
that felt
Cyrus
more
fan.
natural
Like
and
I
even
said, I
edgy
was
at
so
times.
shocked when they
She
made
was
Kristen
never a
Stewart the face.
confirmed Chanel girl,
And
but
then
she's worn it
also
often enough
Miley
for a long
Cyrus,
enough period of
the
time
face.
that I think she could be considered an honorary one. Like Gabrielle before him, Lagerfeld was also subject to controversy, with the designer receiving multiple allegations of sexism, racism, and fat phobia over the years.
Exactly.
In an interview
We
with
gotta
Harper's
cover
Bazaar,
this.
he once claimed that Gabrielle Chanel was never a feminist because she was, quote, "never ugly enough for that." When the Me Too movement was making strides, Lagerfeld said, quote, "If you don't want your pants pulled about, don't become a model. Join a nunnery. There'll always be place for you in the convent." and continued to make his stance on sexual assault clear by sending flowers to Dominique Strauss-Kahn while he was on trial for rape. Lagerfeld, who often directed Chanel's campaigns, also put model Claudia Schiffer in yellowface and blackface for a 2010 editorial. When criticized for his choice to exclusively feature uber-skinny models on the Chanel runway, his response was, quote, "These are fat mummies sitting with their bags of crisps in front of the television, saying that thin models are ugly. No one wants to see round women." By the 2010s, Lagerfeld had been designing for the House of Chanel for over 30 years, and it was starting to show. When he began working with the brand back in the 80s, he innovated upon what came before him, paying homage to Chanel's history while also pushing the boundaries. But by the 21st century, it was starting to feel like he had run out of ideas. While he had successfully brought Chanel back into the public eye, helping its signature pieces achieve cult status and raising the brand's overall prestige, over the course of the decade, critical reception had soured, with many saying that the seemingly endless sea of tweed suits, houndstooth jackets, and two-tone ballet flats all looked the same. While their accessories, cosmetics, and fragrances continued to sell, in large part because of the brand's popular ambassadors and campaigns, by the end of the 2010s, it was reported that sales of clothing items had plummeted, with Gucci and Prada dominating the youth market. Before he was able to stage a critical and commercial comeback, Karl Lagerfeld passed away in February 2019 at the age of 85, and the final collection he completed before his death served as his funeral, with the show being attended by his friends and including a moment of silence. Shortly after, Virginie Viard was appointed the artistic director of Chanel, an obvious choice as she had been at Chanel since 1987, even being named the director of their creation studio in 2000, where she worked closely with Lagerfeld and oversaw haute couture, ready-to-wear, and accessories. Lagerfeld adored her, saying, quote, "Virginie is the most important person, not just for me, but also for the studio, for everything. She is my right hand, and even if I don't see her, we are constantly on the phone." Viard's first solo collection for Cruise 2020 paid homage to both Gabrielle Chanel and Karl Lagerfeld, but with an overemphasis on subtlety and minimalism, many found the collection to be derivative, hardly the shakeup the brand needed. Honestly, the most impressive thing about the show was a set design, a frequent comment directed at Chanel during the 2010s and 2020s. Unfortunately, this was a high point for Viard's Chanel, and each collection since has grown more and more disappointing. While these lackluster, repetitive looks could theoretically be saved if worn by the right person, Chanel hasn't been doing well in that department either. Viard has continued working with the brand's ambassadors that Lagerfeld had previously selected, dressing Kristen Stewart, Margot Robbie, and Penelope Cruz in uninspired and outright hideous ensembles, leaving the internet begging for them to be released from their Chanel contracts.
Ouch.
A few new faces have been introduced, including Jenny Kim, Sadie Sink, Margaret Qualley, and Whitney Peak, the latter of which replacing Keira Knightley as the face of Coco Mademoiselle after 16 years. No offense to Whitney Peak, but her main claim to fame is her role on the failed Gossip Girl reboot. Whereas when Keira Knightley was first announced for the perfume, she was coming off of the blockbuster hits Pride and Prejudice and Pirates of the Caribbean. It's not a very comparable changing of the guards. While these new faces do succeed in bringing freshness and youth to a brand that's beginning to come across as matronly, most of them have yet to develop enough of a style identity or star power to impact Chanel's intended audience the way ambassadors of the 90s and 2000s did. Unlike Chanel girls of the past, who seemed to genuinely love the brand and incorporated its items into their wardrobes organically, these modern ambassadors come across less as muses and more like mannequins. Instead of keeping their personal style in mind, or what actually suits them, they're often just thrown into whatever has recently been on the runway.
Yeah.
And with their head-to-toe Chanel outfits, I feel like they should be walking around with a sign that says #sponsored. While Chanel has never shied away from Hollywood product placement, as we've seen, the fact that they're now paying for this promotion couldn't be more obvious. Take Emily in Paris, for instance. You can't watch a single episode without being smacked in the face with half a dozen Chanel logos. This is also the case for the 2021 Princess Diana biopic, Spencer. But considering Diana did have a history of wearing Chanel, although not that much, it kind of makes sense.
It makes sense, yeah.
Although I will say that it's kind of funny that Kristen Stewart looked better in these Chanel designs than what they usually put her in.
I agree.
A more recent complaint directed towards the brand has been its decreasing quality and increasing price, as seen with the Advent calendar debacle of 2021, with Chanel charging over $800 for plastic trinkets. A more well-known example is their iconic 255 purse, which, as we've mentioned, is one of their signature items. Back in 1955, the bag was first sold for $220, which is just under $2,500 today. In the 1980s, the bag's price went up to $1,000, which is about $3,700 today. That is an increase, but not an obscene one, especially since the product's quality wasn't sacrificed. But more recently is when things start to get crazy. Between 2014 and 2022, the classic Chanel flat bag went from $4,400 to $8,800, meaning its price
Crazy.
doubled in less than a decade. People have hypothesized that this is an attempt on Chanel's end to position the bag as a luxury item akin to the Hermes Birkin, which is notorious for being as expensive as it is valuable.
Yeah.
Value is the key word there, as Birkins are not only known to be well made, but can actually be considered investments.
Exactly.
Meanwhile, the modern
Because they're art
255 has
pieces.
received multiple complaints about its
These
cheap
are just
hardware and overprocessed leather.
Redos
Chanel has been
of the
on
same
every
bag.
fashionista's mind recently as we move closer to the 2023 Met Gala, whose
Ooh,
theme, Karl
Olivier.
Lagerfeld, a line of beauty, pays homage to one of the brand's most notable designers. Because Lagerfeld has been involved with multiple fashion brands since the start of his career,
I
wearing
covered that.
Chanel isn't a necessary requirement
Check my
for
labs.
attendees. But considering celebrities have a habit of misinterpreting the theme and going for what's obvious, I wouldn't be surprised if we wind up seeing a bunch of tweed suits and Chanel logos on the red carpet. If past Met Galas are taken into consideration, we're likely to see a dozen Chanel ambassadors in underwhelming designs, which is a shame since they're probably the only people with access to the archive. But I guess we'll see what happens in May. Remaining relevant in the fashion industry for over a century is no simple task. And although
Agreed.
Chanel has had its ups and downs, it should
Love
still
that
be
movie.
commended for revolutionizing fashion
She
on
did
multiple
such a good job,
occasions.
Qatar.
What do you hope to see from Chanel in the future? And are there any celebrities that you think would be a perfect fit
She's
for the
wrapping it
brand?
up.
I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye.
She did a great job. We got to give her a like, Avi. And we're going to jump right into the next one. Wasting no time. Oh, crap. Because I feel like going right into the segment about Virginia Viard leaving the house just makes sense. So can Chanel save its shattered reputation? It's 10 minutes. Let's watch it.
Chanel has
Sorry. In case you did not know, Virginia Viard literally, what I'm filming this on July 20th, left the house maybe 6 weeks ago, a month and a half ago. When did this creator create this? Anyway, all right, we'll talk about it after. Let's watch it.
gone through one of the biggest changes in its history this past. Chanel has gone through one of the biggest changes in
Okay.
its history this past week. After years of speculation, the iconic brand finally said goodbye to its controversial creative director, Virginie Viard. Not surprisingly, the news was welcomed by dozens of fans online, as very few seem to be enjoying Viard's creative vision for the
I
brand.
was shocked.
However, even though this
I
was
was
a major
shocked. I
step in
thought she had
embracing a
been
different
killing it.
direction for the brand, in reality, the future of Chanel still remains ambiguous as we have yet to get a new creative director for the brand so far. Nevertheless, behind the scenes rumors and the reasons behind Viard's leave still give us some clues on what to expect from Chanel moving forward. The real question remains in the air though. Can Chanel save its shuttered reputation? If you are into the luxury fashion world, you probably know that rumors about Virginie Viard's departure from Chanel have circulated for years. However, when the head of fashion and accessories, Bruno
She
Pavlovsky,
was
expressed
struggling
how
for a
well
few
Viard is
seasons.
doing
I'm
in the
not gonna
brand
lie.
back in May, we all trusted them. He said with utmost confidence, Virginie is doing extremely well. Ever since she succeeded Karl Lagerfeld, people have speculated about other designers of Chanel, but I want to be clear. Chanel is not looking for a new artistic director, and you can print that. Well, they did print that, and here we are saying goodbye to Viard. Anyway, Viard, who took
Crazy.
over in 2019, left Chanel just weeks after the company reported its annual earnings, revealing a 16% growth to $19.7 billion dollars and an 11%
Billion.
increase
Whoa.
in operating profit to $6.4 billion dollars in 2023. I mean, I'm not an economist by any means, but personally, these numbers do not look bad to me at all. In fact, apparently, under Viard, Chanel's fashion
Agree.
business grew by 2.2 times, with ready to wear increasing by 2.5 times in a 23. So I doubt that the reason
See?
behind Viard's departure is economic. Instead, I feel like the real reason is the reputation of the brand in the luxury circles. I mean, I can't be the only one who keeps seeing Chanel products being compared to Zara on TikTok, right? Don't get me wrong, I'm not a Viard hater by any means, not a fan of hers, obviously, but I have to admit that she was cursed with the successor syndrome, which makes me feel bad for her. Like, imagine replacing Karl Lagerfeld of all people after
I
his
know,
more than
right?
30 years long reign received praise after praise. Like, even if Viard was a fashion genius, she had massive shoes to fill, and it was a losing game from the beginning. Considering
Agreed.
this, I honestly think she resisted the pressures and criticisms quite well for all these years. Karl Lagerfeld's tenure at Chanel was marked by his grand, bold, and theatrical designs that continually pushed boundaries. His elaborate runway shows and dramatic reinterpretations of Chanel's heritage set a high bar for creativity and spectacle. Following such a highly regarded and flamboyant designer, Viard's more understated and subtle approach can seem less exciting by comparison. Lagerfeld often used dramatic silhouettes and made extensive use of tweed, pearls, and chains, adding his signature touches to classic Chanel coats. Viard, on the other hand, focused on wearability. She emphasizes comfort, elegance, and a more
Yes.
relaxed approach to
Nothing wrong
luxury.
with
Her
that.
collections tend to have a softer, more feminine touch with a focus on tailoring and the practicality of the garments. She often
Exactly.
incorporated lighter fabrics,
What
simpler
Chanel was
lines,
all
and less
about.
extravagant detailing, aiming for a more approachable and everyday luxury feel. Personally, I think she was on point when it came
Yep.
to everyday wear, but
I agree.
as far as the luxury feeling goes, I think she missed the mark more often than not. Plus, Lagerfeld's runway shows were
But do we need
renowned
that
for their
much opulence
spectacular
every
and often
day?
elaborate settings, transforming venues into thematic extravaganzas such as supermarkets, space stations, beaches, and more. Viard's runway presentations, on the other hand, are
She
more
has some good
subdued and
venues,
intimate compared
good
to Lagerfeld's
presentations. I'm
grand
not gonna lie.
spectacles. She often preferred settings that highlight the craftsmanship and details of the garments, often using simpler, more elegant backdrops that focus on the models and the clothing. Their design visions were also completely different. Lagerfeld had a more experimental and eclectic approach, often pushing the boundaries of fashion and mixing different eras, styles, and influences. Viard, on the other hand, focused on continuity and evolution, maintaining Chanel's timeless elegance while making subtle updates. And I think all these differences resulted from the fact that they took their inspiration from completely unrelated sources. As we all know, Lagerfeld drew inspiration from a wide array of sources, including art, history, pop culture, and
Yeah.
global influences. Viard's inspirations, however, are more grounded in the everyday life of
Everyday
women,
life.
often
Yeah.
drawing from personal experiences and the essence of Parisian chic. As a result, a lot of critics argued that Viard's collections lacked the innovation and boldness that were hallmarks of Lagerfeld's era,
At the end of the day,
perceiving
you
her
just
work
want to
as
sell
safe and
it.
uninspiring. Also, a lot has changed in fashion since the 1980s,
Yeah.
and
I
while
don't
many
need
hoped
art
for
every
Viard to
day.
grasp the zeitgeist of 2020's fashion, for many, her approach didn't align with the current cultural and fashion landscape, which often celebrates bold, diverse, and innovative expressions of style. Especially people who expect high fashion to always be about spectacle and excess did not resonate with Viard's subtle style at all. Of course, a lot of this is about personal preference, but you get the gist. In a nutshell, there is a perception that her collections are too conservative and did not take enough risks to ensure Chanel remains at the cutting edge of fashion, which inevitably led to her downfall. Now, Chanel has the big task of replacing Viard and
Right?
somehow
Who with
managing to
who?
return the brand to its Lagerfeld era glorious days. In other words, whoever gets the job will have massive pressure on their shoulder. The new creative director must not only design captivating collections, but also understand the brand's history and consistently evolve its image across all customer touchpoints. I don't know about you guys, but I wouldn't want that job, that's for sure. Nevertheless, a lot of people put their trust in the brand CEO, Lena Nair, when it comes to making the right choice. And when I
Ooh,
look at
we
the
still got
names
some
being
time on this
discussed for the
video. I thought
position,
he was
I'm
wrapping
also
up.
hopeful for the brand. Hedi Slimane is the number one name circulating around.
Oh,
Business of
another
Fashion
man.
reported
We'll talk
that
about that in a
Slimane
second.
has been engaged in thorny
But he's
contract
amazing.
negotiations
Hedi
since last
Slimane.
autumn.
He's amazing.
So Slimane is a hot name in the fashion world right now. I mean, I'm not surprised, especially after seeing their work in
Yeah.
Celine, which is one of the top luxury
Celine. Yeah.
brands of the past couple of years, in my opinion. Slimane is famous for his rock and roll inspired style, characterized by skinny silhouettes, sharp
Very pop
tailoring, and a
culture.
minimalist,
Very hot.
androgynous look. His work often reflects a rebellious youth culture with a
Yeah.
focus on edgy, timeless pieces.
Which
Honestly,
the
I'm not
brand
sure
probably
how his
wants.
aesthetic would align with Chanel's heritage, but
Yeah.
it might be interesting to see.
Yeah.
Another name is Nicolas Guesquier from
Oh,
LV.
Guesquier?
Guesquier is known for his futuristic
Come
and
on.
innovative approach to
He's too
fashion.
busy.
His designs often blend high tech materials with classic silhouettes, creating a modern avant garde aesthetic that pushes the boundaries of
He can't
traditional fashion.
cover both
Personally, I'm not a
houses.
huge
That's
fan of his
too
style,
hard.
but I get why Chanel would want a name like his, as he can modernize the brand very easily while posing a stark difference to VR. Pier Paolo Piccioli, who is often celebrated for his romantic and
Guesquier has
ethereal
been not
designs
so
at
good. Ooh,
Valentino, is
Pierre
another name
Pialo
that comes
is
to mind for the
amazing.
top job position in
I
fashion.
just want
His
another
aesthetic
woman.
emphasizes delicate fabrics, intricate details, and strong use of color, often blending classic elegance with a contemporary twist.
Too
I
many
think
men
Lagerfeld
coming
might
into
have
the
liked
houses these
Piccioli's
days.
vision. But deep down, my heart desires to
But he is
see another
amazing.
woman as the creative director of the biggest fashion brand of our time. And one name that stands out is Sarah Burton. I
Uh,
mean, let's be honest,
is she
luxury
really
fashion has
what
a
going
gender
from a
imbalance
queen?
problem
Wait,
when it
hold
comes
on.
to
I'm
people
pausing
in the
my.
directorial positions.
Okay,
So, to
sorry.
bring
Hold
more
on. Whoa,
balance
whoa,
to
whoa,
the
whoa.
industry, a
What's up?
name
What's
like
up? What's
Burton
up?
would
What's
be
up? Okay, she's making a very bold claim here. I mean, Sarah Burton was literally at Alexander McQueen's side on his death. And I know that she just recently left McQueen. If she would be the new Chanel creative director, I will literally fall out. I will fall out. You know how much I love McQueen. If you don't know, trust. If you're new to my channel, trust. I mean, I've been wondering where Sarah was going to go since she left McQueen. If she becomes the new creative director of Chanel, I will literally die. This creator, she's got me. She's got me. I don't know where she's going with this, but woo, that would be amazing. Oh my God. Okay. Sorry. Sorry, I had to interrupt there. Let's back that up just a second. Wow. If Sarah Burton left McQueen to go to Chanel, I will die because, all right, we'll talk about it at the end. We'll talk about it in a second. Okay, here we go.
So, to bring more balance to the industry, a name like Burton would be amazing for the task. Her designs for
Amazing.
Alexander McQueen are known for their dramatic and theatrical elements. She combines intricate craftsmanship with dark Gothic romanticism,
Oh, I
often
love
featuring
her.
elaborate embellishments and bold sculptural shapes. Personally, I really like her aesthetic and would love to
Love
see
her
her
aesthetic.
as the leading name of Chanel. Another woman who is being mentioned as a potential candidate for Chanel is
Oh,
none other than our beloved Phoebe Philo.
ooh.
As we all know,
Okay,
Philo is renowned for her minimalist,
we'll
chic, and
talk about that at
effortlessly
the end too.
sophisticated aesthetic. Her work often features clean lines, luxurious fabrics, and a strong focus on comfort and practicality, creating timeless, understated
That
elegance.
would be
I don't know
great.
anyone who disliked Philo's work and often feel like anyone
Love her
can
work.
find something for themselves in her collections. Still, I'm not sure if her aesthetic would be enough to rebrand and elevate Chanel. Last but not
Good
least, I
point.
hear people mentioning Tom
Oh
Ford
my
or Marc
God.
Jacobs
Tom
as
or
potential
Mark Jacobs,
candidates.
I would die.
Both names I adore, but I doubt either one will get the job.
Yeah.
Ford is known for his glamorous and sensual approach to fashion. His designs often emphasize sleek,
It's
body
like
conscious
uber
silhouettes,
lux,
luxurious materials, and a
uber
bold,
lux.
confident style that exudes opulence and sex appeal. It is impossible not to adore his aesthetic. Jacobs is celebrated for his eclectic and playful aesthetic, blending vintage inspirations with
Yeah,
contemporary trends. His
yeah,
designs often feature bold prints, vibrant colors, and a mix of quirky and classic elements, creating a distinctive and dynamic style. Also,
yeah,
he has a past with Chanel, which is a
yeah,
huge plus.
yes.
Nevertheless, I feel like both are names that are too dominant and might overshadow Chanel as a
Where's
brand,
Jeremy Scott
but that's
going?
just
I
my
need to
humble
know.
opinion. Who knows what the CEO Nair will think about? More importantly, what do you think about all these names? Are you happy to see VR to go? Do you think Chanel will go through a brand renaissance soon? Or have you lost all your hope for the brand? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. Thank you so much for watching. See you soon.
Okay,
n'a pas de succès sans
this
copie, c'est aussi
creator killed it. This creator did an incredible job in this
Chanel
11
has
minute
gone
video. She covered a lot. She got down and dirty. We got to give her like 492 likes. She needs way more likes. Please make sure I will link all of the creators that I'm using today in my description box. Of course, I can't do that until the live ends, but this creator killed it. She did a great job. She did a really good job with that video, and she presented some really great replacements of who Chanel should use. And again, I'm going to advocate for Jeremy Scott. Where is Jeremy Scott going to go? He needs to land somewhere. All right, let's take a look at, let's see if I can find the video of Chanel um, with Wallace Simpson, because I'm just, again, that whole section of her life is one that I am so fascinated by, because the documentaries and things that I have learned about her life, other movies that I've learned about Chanel's life, never told that story of her wartime years, which is why I wanted to cover it tonight. And I'm just looking really quickly. If I don't find it, we're going to move on to her apartment. But I did want to watch the video, which is a very short video. Let's see. Let's put in and Walla Simpson. Let's just put that in, get to the video right away. Okay, this video is from 7 years ago. I've got one. I really just wanted to know her relationship. A look at style icon Wallace Simpson, the late Duchess of Windsor, the Jessica unveiling icon's final days, Coco Chanel. There was one that was like Coco Chanel and Wallace Simpson. If I can't find it, we're just going to go to the one that I can find. I don't want to drag this video out any longer. Okay. Very first video that I'm seeing, Chanel and Wallace Simpson. Oh, this is it. Damn. Okay, but it is from 7 years ago, and it's only 8 minutes long. I'm fascinated, absolutely fascinated, just to see that relationship between the two of them, since the whole wartime thing was really what I did not know about her life. So I'm fascinated. All right, let's get it started. Make it full screen. It's only 8 minutes, and then we're going to watch her apartment. Then we're going to wrap up this video. Hopefully it's not subtitled. I mean, subtitling is fine. I just don't want to have to deal with a whole. Oh, it's by Karl Lagerfeld. Wow. Oh, it needs a little more volume. Okay, sorry, I wasn't sharing. I didn't realize you guys weren't seeing what I was seeing. Hang on one sec. I'll go back to the beginning. It's again only 8 minutes, but I want you guys to see from the beginning. I'm still working on my nails. Crazy, right? So low, the volume. I might have to raise it all the way up so you guys can hear it. We'll see what it sounds like when the actual sound starts. But this was a Karl Lagerfeld with this.
Est-ce que quelqu'un peut dire à la duchesse de Windsor de monter, s'il vous plaît? Je monte le chemin.
Now, I don't mind watching subtitled films and things like that, but I know not everybody's into it. So we may have to end it and just move
Mademoiselle,
on.
Son Altesse Royale, la duchesse de Windsor est là.
With the Duchess of Windsor.
Je vous en prie, Votre Altesse.
Are these the no? Clearly not the real
Coco,
people.
hello.
Thank you for coming. I hope your fitting went well.
Oh, it was terribly exciting. Thank you so much. You're so frightfully clever. I love my Chanel suit. You see, before the war, I was only dressed in main bochet and chaparelli.
How difficult. Would you care for a cup of tea?
Of course.
Germaine, could you bring us 2 cups of tea, please?
Oui, mademoiselle. Madame Maud souhaiterait vous montrer le tailleur que vous n'avez pas aimé ce matin. Est-ce que la duchesse y voit un inconvénient?
If the Duchess doesn't mind.
I'd heard so much. I'm really intrigued how you fit.
Okay, you guys, to be honest, this is looking kind of boring. I'm gonna just move on. I'm not into it. We need something better. So we're gonna wrap it up with Mademoiselle. And if you are familiar with French at all, Mademoiselle is for someone that was never married. And since she was never married, we call her Mademoiselle Chanel. And I had her apartment set up. Where in the heck did I put that? Okay. Sorry, guys. I just want to, I'm almost positive. Okay, here we go. We're going to just look at her apartment in Paris, and then we're going to wrap up the video. Hopefully
Coco Chanel's apartment in Paris is an iconic and historic space that reflects the legendary fashion designer's distinctive style and sophisticated taste. Located at 31 Rue Cambon in the heart of Paris, the apartment served as both her living quarters and the headquarters of Chanel. Gabrielle Chanel acquired the building in 1920 and transformed it into a multifunctional space, combining her apartment, a boutique, and her design studio. The entrance of the building leads to a staircase adorned with a mirrored banister, creating a sense of grandeur as visitors ascend to the upper floors. Coco's place was a delightful mishmash of styles. Imagine French classics rubbing shoulders with ancient artifacts, a dash of Italian flair, and even some Japanese deer sprinkled in. Back then, blending East and West was quite the trendsetter, a unique fusion where the best of both worlds came together. The salon on the first floor, where Chanel would host gatherings and meetings, is another highlight of the apartment. This space, like the rest of the apartment, is characterized by meticulous attention to detail. The mirrored walls and carefully placed objets d'art create an atmosphere of timeless elegance. Chanel's personal apartment, located on the second floor, is a testament to her affinity for blending comfort with sophistication. The apartment itself is a testament to Chanel's timeless aesthetic, characterized by a monochromatic palette of black and white. The space exudes an air of understated elegance, featuring clean lines, mirrored surfaces, and a harmonious blend of modern and antique furnishings. Chanel's love for simplicity is evident in the carefully curated decor, which includes crystal chandeliers, lacquered screens, and plush carpets. One of the most famous features of the apartment is the mirrored staircase that connects Chanel's private quarters to her design studio on the upper floor. This staircase allowed her to discreetly observe fashion shows without being seen, a practice she continued until her passing in 1971. The mirrored staircase, which Gabrielle Chanel affectionately referred to as the spiritual staircase, is a masterpiece in itself. It not only reflects Chanel's penchant for symmetry, but also serves a practical purpose. It allowed her to discreetly observe fashion shows in the boutique below without being directly visible to the audience.
Yeah.
A hidden door on the mirrored staircase leads to a discreet library. This bookshelf-lined space not only served as a private retreat for Chanel, but also reflected her intellectual pursuits and love for literature. All of Coco's books have deep red tones, just like the iconic lipstick she created and the inside lining of the bags. Chanel's personal art collection. Chanel was an avid art collector, and her apartment housed an impressive collection of artworks from renowned artists. Paintings by friends such as Salvador Dali adorned the walls, reflecting the eclectic mix of her personal tastes and the artistic milieu of the time.
You gotta check out the
In her
Dali
private
Museum
apartment,
in Paris.
Chanel had a replica of the Venus de Milo,
So
the
amazing.
ancient Greek statue symbolizing beauty and love. Its presence added a classical touch to the contemporary surroundings, underscoring Chanel's appreciation for timeless beauty. The fireplace in Chanel's apartment featured a bold and unconventional mantelpiece, adorned with a collection of gilded wheat sheaves. This unique design element not only added a touch of whimsy, but also reinforced the theme of prosperity. Coco was very superstitious. Elements of this can be seen all over her apartment, with sculptures of different animals and religious artifacts. She wanted to feel protected at all times. Frog with crystal. When the mouth of a frog is open, it is to bring love, luck, money, and health. If you look closely, you can see a crystal placed in its mouth, another important symbol for Coco. Crystal balls, believed by some to have mystical properties, were strategically placed throughout the apartment. Chanel was drawn to the reflective and refractive qualities of crystals, enhancing the play of light in her carefully curated spaces. The significance of the camellia flower was paramount to Coco Chanel. With its symbolic representation of purity and longevity in Asian culture, the camellia held a pervasive presence in her designs, becoming an integral and recurrent motif in her iconic creations. Throughout Chanel's apartment, you can find subtle and not so subtle lion motifs. The most notable is the gilded lion that graces the apartment's salon, positioned prominently as a symbol of strength, power, and regality. The lion, being Chanel's astrological sign, was a nod to her own fierce and independent personality. Chanel's fascination with lions extended to bronze statues that adorned various corners of her apartment. These majestic creatures were not mere decorations, but representations of her own identity and astrological affinity, infusing the space with a sense of courage and majesty. Alongside the Coromandel screens, Chanel had a penchant for collecting Chinese screens. These intricate and colorful pieces of art added an exotic and eclectic touch to her living spaces, showcasing her appreciation for diverse cultures and aesthetics. Chanel's apartment also boasts a spacious salon where she entertained guests and clients. The room is adorned with symbolic elements, such as her signature camellia flowers
and lion motifs, reflecting her astrological sign, Leo. The apartment's design highlights her appreciation for minimalism and functionality, with furniture chosen for both its aesthetic appeal and practical use. While journalists visited Coco in the salon, it also hosted many of her famous friends, such as Elizabeth Taylor, Salvador Dali, and Pablo Picasso. The Grand Salon on the first floor is a showcase of Chanel's hosting prowess. The room is adorned with crystal chandeliers, reflecting her penchant for luxury. It served as a space for entertaining guests, hosting private fashion shows, and conducting business meetings, further blurring the lines between her personal and professional life. Gabrielle Chanel's love for simplicity and monochromatic elegance is evident in the color palette of her apartment. Predominantly adorned in black and white, the color scheme extends to the furniture, upholstery, and even the walls. This timeless combination adds a sense of sophistication and modernity to the space. The boutique on the ground floor serves as a showcase for Chanel's latest designs, providing a seamless transition between her living space and the world of fashion. The famous Chanel No. 5 perfume was created in this very building, solidifying its status as a historic landmark in the world of fashion and fragrance. Even after Coco Chanel's passing, her apartment remains an integral part of the House of Chanel's legacy.
It's a museum now,
It
right?
has been meticulously preserved and serves as an inspiration for subsequent creative directors of the fashion house. Earlier visits to the apartment were by invitation only,
Right.
adding an air of exclusivity to the iconic space that continues to captivate admirers of Chanel's enduring style and influence. After taking a look at the Coco Chanel apartment, what are your thoughts? Is her home as spectacular as you thought it would be? Would you like to visit this apartment? Thank you for
Yes.
watching.
Yes, I would.
Subscribe. See you.
Well, I think that creator did an incredible job. And sadly, I didn't see any of it. I will have to do it on the replay to watch that video. But I learned so much during this little adventure of Coco Chanel's life. Like I said, I was really mostly interested in the war years, since it is something that has been relatively recently come to light as far as what involvement she had with Nazis and things like that. Also, I think that it was a good transition that we sort of went from the first creator that gave us a real backstory on her life, and that, again, section of her life that I did not know about, that I was really fascinated to learn about. And then we moved into the second creator that gave us a really good breakdown from the Coco years to the Karl Lagerfeld years, and then moving into the Virginia VR years. I think that the fact that Virginia VR is leaving the house, let's get into that, because she is just now recently decided to leave the house. I don't really understand it. I thought that the last 2 or 3 seasons, she kind of killed it. Like, all her collections were pretty amazing. I wasn't displeased with any of them. I do understand maybe a few years ago she was struggling a bit right after Carl died, but at the same time, I think that she carried the house beautifully. Now, going on to her predecessors, or going on to her successors, who they decide to pick for that house, is going to be fascinating. I actually haven't looked it up. I'm certain by now they probably have decided who is going to be the new creative director of Chanel. I just want it to be a woman. I believe that I put up a video not too long ago about the fact that all of the houses are all of the houses that had women heading up as creative director are now giving in to men. And my issue with that is it's just not the same when a man designs a collection for a woman. That's my opinion. I just believe that we need more female creative directors in the industry. It's imperative to continue that trajectory, as far as I'm concerned, on having women as creative directors, women designing for women. I think that sometimes men lose the mark in that area. And if either Sarah Burton or Phoebe Philo, we'll talk about that in a second, take over the house, I'll be really thrilled, just because I just need more women in the industry. As far as Phoebe Philo goes, if she does take over the house, that will be fascinating. When she had left the industry for a few years, I guess, to find herself, then she came back with this huge launch, and the price point just was outrageous. It was so outrageous that I don't even know if she was able to sell any of that collection. And I think that putting her feet into the House of Chanel will be a good idea, just because she may be a little bit out of touch on what it is that people want. And especially with the economy the way that it is, a lot of the luxury houses are taking these things into consideration. Of course, they have to make a profit at the end of the day, but if no one's buying your stuff because it's too out of touch with the price point that people need, where are you going to sell it? Where are you going with that? And I think that when she came out with, Phoebe Philo came out with her launch after being gone for, what was it, 2 years, 3 years, and she was selling literally tote bags for $800. People are like, are you crazy? What are you thinking? Like, your first launch back should be at a more affordable price point to get the younger generation to know who you are, what you're about, and that you are going to be a recognizable name that they can come back to in the future. But when you put them so far out of reach on your price point, they're not going to buy what you're selling. You need to go to like the House of Chanel, where you can get a little of your art out there without breaking the bank, so that people know who you are. That's really what it is about at the end of the day. So I think that either Sarah Burton, because who knows where she's going to end up, Phoebe Philo, I think would be good for the house. She's an amazing designer. She's an incredible talent, but that whole relaunch just blew me. The other person that I mentioned out there that they didn't mention in the other video was Jeremy Scott. And that's because I am such a massive fan. Outside of Alexander McQueen, Jeremy Scott, Michael Kors, those are like my laminated list. I'm just dying to find out where he's going to land. Is he going to just go ahead and do his own line? I would love that. I don't know that he's necessarily going to work at Chanel. I would have loved to have seen him take over McQueen, as opposed to, why am I drawing a blank on his name right now? I literally just had it a second ago. But but I would have loved to seen Jeremy Scott take over the McQueen house. And yeah, either that or him just do his own line. All right, you guys, we are rocking on 3 hours. I'm almost done my nails. I still have a lot more to do. I'm going to go ahead and peel off this final mask as we end this video, because it's just so satisfying. Oh my goodness. Anybody that has a peel off mask, if you know, you know. Just the whole process of peeling it off into one piece. Oh my gosh. Look at that. Oh, the glam glow. Literally one piece. That's my whole face. I love these masks. Anyway, we're going to go ahead and end the video there. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really have been enjoying doing these Saturday evening movie nights where we learn a little bit about fashion and also do a little skincare, self-care nights, Saturday evenings. You know, us people over 50, where are we going? And not only that, but in case you guys don't know, here in Belize, there is not a lot to do. There's no movie theaters or malls or places to go. So being able to bring these movie nights to you guys is a little bit self-indulgent because I literally have nothing else to do with my evening. So it has been a lot of fun, but also just learning more about fashion history. So please make sure to leave a comment to let me know if you're interested in doing the whole thing with the high people in the fashion industry, or would you rather me do the Schiaparelli movie next? And I think that I'm going to keep doing these. They have been getting a lot of traction, and hopefully this one will too. But we are oh gosh, I just totally moved my whole desk because I'm trying to move my chair, because we are way past the time limit from the last movie. But I did want to make sure that I covered every aspect of Coco Chanel's life that I could find for you guys. It was really fun. It was really fascinating. I did learn a lot. I'm going to go ahead, finish up my skincare, finish up my nails. And I hope you guys just enjoyed this Saturday movie night. Again, make sure to leave me a comment to what movie you want me guys to cover next. We might do Dior, whatever it is, let me know. Thank you guys so much for watching. And of course, I've got to do my long StreamYard thing about ending my video. But I look forward to seeing you guys in my next video. And until next time, stay fashionable. Bye. Is there anything that I forgot? I think I covered everything. Make sure to check out my history of lipstick video. And I've got a ton more fashion videos. Oh, that was it. That's what the other thing was to say, is that my yoga videos have been getting a little bit of traction. I'm really excited about that. And I do hope that you guys will join me live. At the moment, it is on Thursdays at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you want me to change the time to an earlier time to do a morning workout as opposed to a mid-stretch workout, please let me know. If you'd rather me do it in the evening, whatever the time is, whatever the majority says that you guys would like me to see, you would like to see those yoga videos, I'm there for you. So thank you guys again so much for watching, and enjoy the rest of your weekend, you guys. I'm going to go finish this glass of wine, do my makeup, it's going to be a whole self-care evening. Good night, guys.